So in this video, I'm going to read an article, or it's a small essay, and I got to know about this while watching a podcast, and that is the myth of the Sisyphus. The myth of a Sisyphus, and I'm going to read about it. Okay, I know the basic idea of it. I know I know the summary of it, but I wanted to read deeper of it, right? And okay, so first it goes to what is Sisyphus. Let's go deeper into it. Just go to the deepest of it. Sisyphus and the myth of Sisyphus in a Greek mythology. In Greek mythology, a Sisyphus or Sisyphos is the founder and the king of Epria. He reveals Zeus' abductions of Aegina to the river god Sisyphus, thereby incurring Zeus' wrath. His subsequent cheating of death earns him eternal punishment in the underworld. Okay, so I'll just um, brief summary of Sisyphus. Okay, brief summary of Sisyphus. So it seems that he's a king. So yeah, so this entire thing, the Sisyphus thing, it's in the Greek, mythology, and in a Greek mythology, Sisyphus was the king. Okay, was the really king of Corinth, who was condemned by Zeus to rule animals. Okay, Zeus. Okay, I want to see the Zeus. Zeus is the god. Zeus is the god. Okay, Zeus is the supreme ruler of gods in ancient, Greek mythology, presiding over the sky, weather, law, order, justice. As the youngest son of the Titans Cronus and Rhea, he famously overthrew his father and established the reign of the Olympian gods. So this is how it looks like. Zeus, yeah, the thunder god also, yeah. And okay, domain, the king of Mount Olympus, god of the sky, thunder, lightning, the lightning bolt, eagle, the oak tree, Roman equivalent Jupiter, sibling Poseidon, the god of the sea, Hades, Hera, goddess of the marriage, Demeter, Jessica, the Titanomany, divine forces, lovers and offspring, okay, all those things. Was Apollo, was Zeus a god? Zeus was the supreme deity of the the Greek pantheon. He is the sky and thunder in ancient Greek. Okay, so he was the person who, in Greek mythology, Sisyphus was the willy king of the Corinth, who was condemned by Zeus to roll an immense boulder up a hill for all eternity, only for it to roll back down every time it neared the top. So today, his story is widely known as the classical myth and the central metaphor in Albert Camus' 1942 political philosophical essay, The Myth of the Sisyphus. So I'll just tell you what I know in the basic summary of it, right? So the Sisyphus means it's a king, it's an ancient king, and he faked, or he did something which will make him immortal. That means he will not die. He faked his own death, and for the punishment of this, the Zeus, the Greek, mythologist king, he gives him a punishment, stating that he has to. Most of the people might have seen the picture, that there's a picture of a hill, and there's a person, and that person is a Sisyphus, and he has to push the rock all the way to the top of the mountain, and then when he reaches the mountain, then again, he'll go back again, and then he has to roll back again, the same thing over and over. He has to do this continuously. The Greek myth is equals to the trickster king Sisyphus. Okay, so the trickster king Sisyphus was notorious for his deceitfulness, hubris, and cleverness, and betraying Zeus, he angered the king of the gods by revealing the location of name Zeus had kidnapped. So it seems that Zeus had kidnapped someone, and then he revealed the secret, cheating death. So when death came for him, Sisyphus tricked death into his own chain, briefly making humans immortal. The punishment, as retribution for his defiance, the gods sentenced him to a lifetime of fruitless, repetitive labor in the underworld. Okay, Camus philosophical. So, as far as I know, the the person who wrote the myth of the Sisyphus, that entire essay, it has little to do with the Greek mythology. It has everything to do with the fact that he just correlated it um with the human beings currently, right? That when we wake up, we go to work, we do all those things, we come back, we sleep, and tomorrow again we do the same thing again and again and again and again and again, right? Till we die. So that is basically what he's saying, is that just applying the same logic to the human, is that we wake up, we go to work, hard work, work hard, work hard, come back, sleep, again, do the same thing tomorrow and tomorrow again and again. Same like the Sisyphus, right? And he talks about that, and he talks about how to break this chain. So I'm going to read about it. And Okay, this is the Greek myth and Camus' philosophical interpretations. In his famous essay, philosopher Albert Camus uses Sisyphus to outline his theory of absurdism. The absurd hero, Camus compares Sisyphus' endless labor to the human condition, where individuals search for meaning in a silent, meaningless universe. The rejection of suicide, okay? Camus argued that recognizing life is meaningless shouldn't lead to suicide. Argues that the recognizing life is meaningless shouldn't lead to suicide or false religious hopes revolved through joy. Instead, human must rebel by consciously accepting the struggle. The ultimately conclusions. Because Sisyphus owns his fate and continues to push the rock anyway, Camus famously concludes, one must imagine Sisyphus happy. If you'd like to explore this further, let me know if you want to focus on. Okay, so I want to know about the absurdism, right? Okay, please explain absurdism in brief and also talk little more about the summary of myth of Sisyphus. Okay, so what is absurdism? Okay, absurdism is a philosophical thought. Okay, yeah. Absurdism is a philosophical stating that humans desperately seek meaning in life, but the universe refuses to give any. This clashes creates absurd. So yeah, we say that it's absurd, right? So okay, so this one says that we human being, I don't know how many people have the time to just sit and retrospect and contemplate this life and ask the question, why am I here in this on this earth? What is the purpose of this life? We don't have time for this, but I'm just talking about normally. Some people do that and ask this question. And some people think that the purpose in life is to do this, do that, or serve this, serve that. And this philosophical thought of absurdism says that there's no purpose as such. When I think of this, I also, kind of remember of Friedrich Nietzsche. He says that there's no purpose in life, and I think he is mostly okay. Just wait. He is mostly um Friedrich Nietzsche is famous philosophical. Okay, so God interested. This one's God is dead. Okay, yeah. I've read the summary of God is dead, and I've also read the Ubermensch. Okay, the Superman and Overman. The will to power, slave, mortality is eternal. Okay, this one's okay. Okay, just what is this? Okay, I mean philosophy. God is dead. Okay, the will to power, say morality, women must do. Okay, so other up. Yeah, so I was talking about the nihilism, right? And Friedrich Nietzsche was widely regarded as the modern father of nihilism. However, he did not invent the philosophy to right? And nihilism means there's no purpose in life. So then I'll just nihilism. I know that, but I kind of forgot it exactly what it is, right? Nihilism is the philosophical belief that life is without an objective meaning, purpose, or intrinsic value, originating from the Latin word nihil. But then nihilism, right? Okay, then what is the differences between nihilism versus absurdism, right? Absurdism, existentialism, and versus existentialism. Nihilism, existentialism, and absurdism are three philosophical frameworks that attempts to grapple with a world that inherently lacks objective meaning or purposes. Nihilist states that life has no meaning. Nihilism states that life has no meaning. Existentialism states that states that because life has no meaning, you must create your own. Existentialism. Absurdism states that trying to find meaning is futile, but you should embrace this chaos anyway. So nihilism equals to the problem, right? So nihilism is that is what is the problem? That life has no meaning. And the solution of rebellion equals to absurdism, and existentialism is the solution of a creation. Nihilism, specifically existential nihilism, is the foundational belief that the universe possesses no inherent purpose, no meaning, no intrinsic value. A strict nihilist believes that any attempts to create or find meaning are ultimately pointless. It is essential a rejection of objective truths, moral framework, and inherent significance. So this is the definition of nihilism. And Friedrich Nietzsche was kind of a modern father of it, okay, nihilism. And then we'll talk about the existentialism. Existentialism. Some people say that okay, they have a midlife crisis, they have an existential crisis. Some say that, right? So what does it mean is that they don't know why they exist. So that's why existentialism is the existentialism act as a response to the despair of nihilism. championed by thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre, Friedrich Nietzsche. Existentialism argues that while life has no pre-written purposes, this freedom gives you the responsibility to forge your own by making conscious choices, taking personal responsibility, and living authentically. You generate your own. So when nihilism says that life has no meaning as such, no goal, no objective as such, existentialism tells you that since life has no objective, no this one, it's a clean slate. Clean slate. I think it's called clean slate. It's called masala, masala robust. No, robustu. Masala robusta. Okay, rosa. Okay, just wait. Okay, I forgot about it. It's in it's in Latin. Hmm. Okay, absurdism point of the camera cases is first okay, and Petronicius because breathing to choose our own others too, and okay, Chairman with thinkers, okay, existing industry, the world has no means. The freedom gives a responsibility to fortune response, okay. And now comes absurdism, the solution of rebellion. Absurdism, pioneered by the Albert, Camus in the myth of Sisyphus, directly critiques the existentialist attempts to manufacture personal meaning. Absurdism defines the absurd. Okay, just wait. Okay, what is it called in clean slate? Clean slate. Clean slate in Latin. Yeah, I think rabasa. Okay, tabula rasa. Okay, tabula rasa. So tabula rasa means it's a clean slate. That means with a new life or a new page or something like that. Clean slate. Tabula rasa. No, tabula rasa. Tabula rasa. It's a Latin word. It's a ancient Roman Latin clean slate is translated tabula rasa. Okay, in Latin tabula. Tabula rasa. Okay, tabula rasa. So we're talking about this one existentialism, and we're talking about now talk about the absurdism. It was pioneered by the uh, Albert Camus in The Myth of Sisyphus, directly crediting the existentialist attempts to manufacture personal meaning. Absurdism defines the absurd as the conflict between humanity's desperate need for inherent meaning and the universe's cold, silent, meaningful void. Instead of trying to solve the problem like existentialist, an absurdist accepts the futility of it all and lives passionately anyway. Camus argued for revolt, embracing the absurdities and living freely with a sense of defiance and joy. I actually couldn't get what this absurdism is a fundamental conflict between our desire for meaning and the world's refusal to provide it. Okay, so just to give you a brief of it. Okay, what I know now. Nihilism states that there's no purpose, there's no objective in life, and except the void, there's no point in anything. And key thinkers is Friedrich Nietzsche. And existentialism it talks about since there's no objective, since there is no objective meaning or a purpose, so you must create your own. We born first, then we define ourselves. So take the responsibilities and create our own meaning. So John Paul and Albert Camus, okay. And then there comes an absurdism. Absurdism states that because there is no meaning, we are trying to create our own meaning. So instead, you just have to accept and embrace it, whatever it is, right? There is a fundamental conflict between our desire for meaning and the world's refusal to provide. So absurdism says that we are trying to find the objective or the purpose and all, but the universe is not giving anything. They refuse to give anything. Now there's a conflict, and there's a fundamental conflict between our desire for meaning and the world's refusal to provide it, and rebel by accepting the absurd and living authentically despite it. So this is the famous, I think, that it was Albert, Camus. Okay, so now, okay, I'll talk about the Albert Camus. Right? Okay, what is this? Albert Camus. Okay, I don't know if his pronunciation is right. Albert, Camus, right? Okay. So he was born in 1913. Okay, so he's fairly new in the sense he's fairly modern person, and he was born 1913. And next year there was a First World War, and he died in 1960. Why is it that most of them died very early? Because George Orwell also he died at the age of 40, 46 something, and then even he died at 46 years of age, 1960, and he is heavily influenced by Franz Kafka, Friedrich Nietzsche, and all those things. Okay, he married twice. So now Albert Camus, he is a French philosopher, but born in Algeria, okay, and novelist. And Albert Camus is a French philosopher, novelist, drama author, journalist, and world federalist and political activist. He was the recipient of the 1957 Nobel Prize in Literature at the age of 44, the second youngest recipient in history, and the first laureate in the literature born in Africa. He was born in Algeria, okay. So we were talking about this thing, okay? So we were talking about this thing, and yeah, and brief summary. Okay, we are back to a brief summary of. We have not just started with the essay. We are just doing a basic check of what all to expect from this. So we are talking about the absurdism, right? Okay, absurdism is a philosophical stating that the human in desperately seek meaning in life, but the universe refuses to give any. The species gets absurd. And according to Albert, Camus, you have three choices when facing the reality: physical suicide, giving up entirely, and yeah, I think Albert Camus is also only known as the suicide and all those things. Okay, so when you are faced with absurdism, then you have a two choice: physically suicide, giving up entirely. Camus rejects this as cowardly. So you can suicide, but Camus says that this is not the solution. You are just being coward, and I think it is true. Giving up entirely, Camus rejects this as cowardly. Philosophical suicide, turning to religion or false hopes. Camus rejects this as intellectually dishonesty. So first you can do suicide, physical suicide. The second is that you philosophical suicide. That means you turn to a religion or a false hope because religion is there's no scientific evidence to back it up. So you just put faith. Faith itself means to believe in something which you don't know whether it is true or not. So he says that it's intellectual dishonesty as intellectual dishonesty. And then third is equals to you accept it. Right? Accepting the meaningless and living anyway with passion and freedom. Accepting, okay, accepting it. That means absurdism, right? You just accept it and anyway embrace it. So this is what the game has chose. Accepting the meaninglessness and living anyway with the passion and freedoms. Albert Camus chosen this path. Okay, and deep dive the myth of Sisyphus. The complete myth, the complete myth is a story of ultimate defiance against the god, broken into three acts. The betrayal of Zeus. Okay, Sisyphus, the clever king of Corinth, witnesses Zeus, kidnap the ninth Hyena. Sisyphus offered to tell her father where she was, but only in exchange for a fresh water spring for his city. He got his water, but he made a mortal enemy of Zeus, cheating, death twice. Chaining, Thanatos, to furious Zeus sent, Thanatos dead to chain Sisyphus in the underworld. Sisyphus slyly, asked Thanatos to demonstrate how the chains worked, trapping death instead. For days, no human on earth could die. The funeral trick. Before finally dying, Sisyphus told his wife to throw his naked body into the public square without a proper burial. Once in the underworld, he complained to Hades that his wife was disrespecting him and asked for permission to return to earth to punish her. Hades agreed, but once Sisyphus was back in the sun, he refused to return. He lived to a ripe old age before being dragged down, back down. The ultimate punishment: to break this arrogant spirit, the gods gave him a task that could never be beaten. He must push a massive boulder up a steep hill. Every single time he reaches the peak, the weight shifts and the rock rolls right back to the bottom, resetting this labor for eternity. Okay, now I think I'm ready to dive into the essay. And the essay is how many pages? I think it is 24 pages. And it's a long one, right? It's a long one. It's not like the normal book. It's a A4 size and it's a long one. So Albert Camus, okay. So I'm starting Camus, The Myth of Sisyphus. Albert Camus, 1913 to 60, gives a quite a different account of philosophical and politics of existentialism from that of a Sartre. Perhaps the most striking differences from Sartre is his conception of the absurd. For Sartre, absurdity belongs to the world prior to activity of consciousness, while Camus' ideas of the absurd is closer to Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. The absurd is a direct consequence of the absence of God. Without God, the discrepancy between human aspiration and the world is acute. The human condition is characterized by the probability of suffering and the certainty of a death, a fate which human reasons cannot accept as a reasonable. In the face of this absurdity, the universal reasons of the Enlightenment has nothing to do with nothing to say. In the myth of Sisyphus, Camus elucidates this concept of the absurd. This absurd comes with the realization that the world is not rational. At this point of his effort, man stands face to face with the irrational. He feels within his longing for happiness and for reason. The absurd is born of this confrontation between the human need and the unreasonable silence of the world. Okay. And okay, just I want to see the picture of it. Okay, Sisyphus. Okay, this is the picture. This is the okay. Volume, distance, effort, friction. The Sisyphus, the bit of Sisyphus. Okay. Albert Camus. Okay, he's a handsome guy. He is a handsome guy. Okay. This confrontation is epitomized in the plague, 1947, in the painful death of a child. The arbitrariness of the plague parallels the absurdity of existence. The absurdity of existence raises the question of suicide, and the meaning of life thus becomes the only truly serious philosophical problem. The myth of Sisyphus is a potent image of the futility. Camus' response is that the only lucid recognition of the absurdity of existence liberates us from the belief in another life and it permits us to live for the instant, for the beauty, pleasure, and the implacable grandeur of existence. Lucidity is the clarity and the courage of a mind which refuses all comforting illusions and self-deception. Lucidity is Camus' notion comparable to Kierkegaard's and Sartre's anguish, but in the end, Camus is more positive than either Kierkegaard's and Sartre. Camus concludes that one must imagine Sisyphus happy. So yeah, I think he says that at last, one must imagine Sisyphus happy. Could he be happy? One must imagine Sisyphus happy, okay? Camus draws the political moral from his confrontation with absurd in the Rebel 1951, which is an ethic of uncompromising honesty and lucid revolt against absurdity. In the most obvious enemies are found in the ship, in a stifling atmosphere of a conventional bourgeois morality, and more horrifyingly in totalitarianism of either fascist or communist varieties. Though a member of the Communist Party as a youth, Camus began openly hostile to communism, rejecting the idea that the ends can justify the meanings and the arrogance of the philosophist of the history which came to know the end in advance. The myth of Sisyphus, absurd reasoning, absurdity and suicide. There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. All the rest, whether or not the world has three dimensions, whether the mind has nine or eight or 12 categories, comes afterwards. There are games one must first answer, and if it is true, as Nietzsche claims, that the philosophers to deserve your respect must teach by example, you can appreciate the importance of that reply, if for it will precede the definitive act. These are the facts the heart can feel, yet they call for careful study before they become clear to the intellects. If I ask myself how to judge that this question is more urgent than that, I replied that one judged by the action it entails. I have never seen anyone die for the ontological argument. Galileo, who had a scientific, truth of a great importance, adjured it with the greatest ease as it endured his life. In certain sense, he did, right? The truth was not worth the stake. Whether the earth or the sun revolves around the other is a matter of a profound indifference. To tell the truth, it is a futile question. On the other hand, I see people die because they judge that the life is not worth living. So he's talking about the suicide. I see others paradoxically getting killed for the ideas or illusion that give them a reason for living. What is called a reason for living is also an excellent reason for dying. I therefore conclude that the meaning of life is the most urgent of question, how to answer it. On all essential problems, I mean thereby to those that run the risk of leading to death or those that intensify the passion of living. There are probably but two methods of thoughts, the methods of La Palissy and the method of Don Quixote. Solely the balance between evidence and lyricisms can allow us to achieve the simultaneously emotional lucidity in a subject at once so humble and so heavy with emotions. The learned and classical dialectic must yield, one can see, to a more modest attitudes of a mind deriving at one and the same from common sense and understanding. Suicide has never been dealt with except as a social phenomenon. On the contrary, we are concerned here at the outset with the relationship between individual thoughts and suicide. An act like this is prepared within the silence of the heart, as is a great work of an art. The man himself is ignorant of it. So one evening he pulls the triggers or jumps off an apartment building managers to had killed himself. I was told that he had lost his daughter 5 years before, that he had changed a great early since, and that the experience had undermined him. More exact words cannot be imagined. Beginning to think is the beginning to be undermined. Beginning to think. Okay, beginning to think is beginning to undermine. Society has but five little connection with such beginnings. The worm is in man's heart. That is where it must be sought. One must follow and understand this fatal game that leads from lucidity in the face of existence to the flight from light. There are many reasons, there are many causes for suicide, and generally the most obvious ones were not the most powerful. Rarely is suicide committed, yet the hypothesis is not excluded from reflections. What sets up the crisis is almost always unverifiable. Newspapers often speak of personal sorrow or incurable illness. These explanations are plausible, but one would have to know whether a friend or the desperate man had not that very day addressed him indifferently. He is the guilty one, but that is not enough to precipitate all the rancors and all the boredom, still, and suspicion. But If it is hard to fix the precise instant, the subtle step when the mind opt for death, it is easier to deduce from the act itself the consequence it implies, in a sense that, and as as in the melodrams, killing yourself amounts to confessing. It is confessing that life is too much for you, or that you do not understand it. Let's not go too far in such analogies. However, I would rather return to everyday words. It is merely confessing that is not worth the trouble. Living naturally is never easy. You continue making the gestures commanded by the existence for many reasons, the first of which is habit. Dying voluntarily implies that you have recognized, even instinctively, the ridiculous character of that habit, the absence of any profound reason for living, the insane characters of that daily agitations, and the uselessness of suffering. What then is that incalculable feeling that deprives the mind of the sleep necessary of life? A word can a world that can be explained even with a bad reason is a familiar word. But on the other hand, in a universe certainly divested of illusions and lights, man feels an alien, a stranger. His exile is without remedy since he is deprived of the memory of a lost home, the hope of a promised land. This divorce between a man and his life, the actor and his settings, is probably the feeling of absurdity. All healthy men having thought of their own suicide, it can be seen without further explanation that there is a direct connection between this feeling and the longing for the death. The subject of this essay is precisely this relationship between the absurd and suicide, the exact degree to which suicide is a solution to the absurd. The principle can be established that for a man who does not cheat, what he believes is to be true must determine his action. Belief in this absurdity when existent must then dictate his conduct. It is legitimate to wonder clearly and without a false pathos whether a conclusion of this importance requires forsaking as rapidly as possible an incomprehensible condition. I'm speaking, of course, of men inclined to be in harmony with himself. Stated clearly, this problem may seem both simple and insoluble, but it is strongly assumed that simple questions involve answers that are no less simple and that evidence implies evidence. A priori and reversing the terms of the problems, just as one does or does not kill oneself, it seems that there are but two philosophical solutions, either yes or no. This would be too easy, but allowances must be made for those who, without concluding continuing question, here I am only slightly indulging in irony. This is the majority. I notice also that those who answers no act as if they thought yes. As a matter of fact, if I accept the Nietzschean criterions, they think yes in one way or another. On the other hand, it often happens that those who commit suicide were assured of the meaning of life. These contradictions are constant. It may even be said that they have never been so keen as on this point, where, on the contrary, logic seems so desirable. It is a commonplace to compare philosophical theories and the behavior of those who profess them. But it must be said that the thinkers who refused a meaning of life, none except Periclo, who belongs to the literatures, Peregrinus, who is in tone of legends, and the Julius Liger, who belongs to the hypothesis, has made his logic to the point of refusing that life. Schopenhauer is often cited as a fit subject for laughter because he praised suicide while seated at a well-set table. There is no subject for joking. That way of not taking tragic seriously is not so grievous, but it helps to judge a man. In the face of such a contradictions and obscurities, must we conclude that there is no relationship between the opinion one has about life and the act one must commit to leave it? Let us not exaggerate in this direction. In a man's attachment to life, there is somebody stronger than all these ills in the world. The boy's judgment is as good as his mind, as good as the mind's and the body's shrink from annihilations. We got into the habit of living before acquiring the habit of drinking. In that race which a daily hasten us towards death, the body maintains its irreparable lead. In short, the essence of that contradiction lies in what I shall call the act of eluding, because it is both less and more than diversion in the Pascalian sense. Eluding is the invariable game. The typical act of eluding, the fatal evasions that constitutes the third theme of this essay, is hope. Hope of another life must deserve or trickery of those who live not for itself, but for some great idea that will transcend it, refine it, give it a meaning, and it betrays. Thus, everything contributes to spreading confusion hitherto, hitherto, and it has not been wasted efforts. People have played on words and pretended to believe that refusing to grant a meaning to life necessarily leads to declaring that it is not worth living. In truth, there is no necessary common measures between these two judgments. One merely has to refuse to be misled by the confusion, reversed inconsistencies previously pointed out. One must brush everything aside and go straight to the real problem. One kills oneself because life is not worth living. That is certainly a truth, yet an unfruitful one because it is a truism. But does that insult to existence, that flat denial in which it is plunged, come from the fact that it has no meaning? But does it? But does it? That does its absurdity? It requires one to escape it through or hope or suicide. This is what must be, that must be clarified, hunted down, and illustrated while brushing aside all the rest. Does the absurd irrigate death? Does the absurd dictate death? This problem must be given priority over others. So, outside all methods of sound and all exercise of the disinterested mind, shades of meaning, contradiction with psychology that an objective mind can always introduce into all problems have no place in this pursuit and this passion. It calls simply for an unjust, in other words, logical thoughts. That is not easy. It is always easy to be logical. It is almost impossible to be logical into, to the bitter ends. Men who die by their own hand consequently follow its confusion in their emotional inclination. Reflection on suicide gives me an opportunity to raise the only problems that interest me. Is there a logic to the point of text? I cannot know unless I pursue without reckless passions in the sole light of evidence. The reasoning of which I am here suggesting the source. This is what I call an absurd reasoning. Many have begun it. I do not yet know whether or not they kept it. When Carl Jaspers, revealing the impossibility of constituting the world as a unit, exclaims, "His limitations leads me to myself, where I can no longer withdraw behind an objective point of view that I am merely representing, where neither I myself nor the existence of another can any longer become an objective for me." He is evoking after many others those waterless desert where thought reaches its confines after many others, yes, indeed, but how eager they were to get out of them. At last, at that crossroads where thought hesitates, many men have arrived, and even some of the humblest, then abdicated what was most precious to them, their lives. Others, princes of mind, abdicated likewise, but they initiated the suicide of their thoughts in its purest revolt. The real effort is to stay there rather in so far as that is possible and to examine closely the odd vegetations of those distant regions. Tenacity and acumen are privilege. As spectators of this inhuman show in which absurdity, hopes, and death carry on their dialogue, the mind can then analyze the figure of that elementary yet subtle and dance before illustrating them and reliving them itself. Absurd walls, like great works, deep feeling always mean more than they are conscious of saying. The regularity of an impulse or a repulsion in a soul is encountered again in habits of doing or thinking, is reproduced in consequence of which the soul itself knows nothing. Great feelings take with them their own universe, splendid or objective. They light up with their passion an exclusive world in which they recognize the climate. There is a universe of jealousy, of ambition, of selfishness, or of generosity. A universe, in other words, a metaphysics and a metaphysic and attitude of mind. What is true of already specialized feeling will be even more so of emotion, basically an indeterminate, simultaneously as vague and as definitive, as remote and as present as those furnished by us by furnished us by beauty or arose by absurdity. At any street corner, the feeling of absurdity can strike any man in the face, as it is in its distressing nudity, in its light without effulgence. It is elusive, but that very difficulty deserves reflections. It is probably true that a man remains forever unknown to us, and that there is in him something irreducible that escapes us. But practically, I know men and recognize them by their behavior, by the totality of their deeds, by the consequence caused in life by their presence. Likewise, all those irrational feelings which offer no purchase to analysis, I can define them practically, appreciate them practically, by gathering together the sum of their consequence in the domain of the intelligence, by seizing and noting all their aspects, by outlining their universe. It is certain that apparently, though I have seen the same actor 100 times, I shall not for that reasons know him any better personally. Yet if I add up the heroes that he has personified, and if I say that I know him a little better than 100 characters counted of, this will be felt to contain an element of a truth. But this apparent paradox is also an apologue. There is a morale to it. It teaches us that a man defines himself by his make believe as well as by his sincere impulses. There is thus a lower key of feelings, inaccessible in the heart, but partially disclosed by the acts they imply and the attitudes of a mind we assume. It is clear that in this way I am defining a method, but it is also evident that that method is one of analysis and not of the knowledge. For methods imply metaphysics, unconsciously they disclose conclusion that they often claim not to know yet. Similarly, the last pages of a book are already contained in the first pages. Such a link is inevitable. The method defined here acknowledges the feeling that all true knowledge is impossible. Solely appearance can be enumerated and the climate makes it itself well. Perhaps we shall be able to overtake that elusive feeling of absurdity in a different but closely related world of intelligence and of art of living or of art itself. The climate of absurdity is in the beginning, the end is the absurd universe and the attitude of a mind which lights the world with its true colors to bring out the privileged and implacable visage with in visage impact implacable visage which that attitude has discerned it. All great deeds and all great thoughts have ridiculous beginning. Great works are often born on a street corners or in a restaurant's revolving doors. So it is with this absurdity. The absurd world more than other derives its nobility from that abject world. In certain situation, replying nothing when asked what one is thinking about may be pretense in the men. Those who are loved are well aware of this, but if that reply is sincere, if it symbolizes that odd states of soul in which the void becomes eloquent, in which the chain of daily gestures is broken, in which the heart vainly seeks the link that will connect it against, then it is as it were the first sign of absurdity. It happens that the stage sets collapse, rising, streetcars, 4 hours in the office or the factory, meal, streetcar, 4 hours of work, meal, sleep, and a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, and accordingly. For the same rhythm, this path is easily followed most of the time, but one day the why arises and everything begins in that weariness, tinged with amazement. Begins this is important. Weariness comes at the end of the acts of mechanical life, but at the same time, it inaugurates the impulse of the consciousness. It awakens consciousness and provokes what follows. What follows is the gradual return in the chain, or it is the definitive awakening. At the end of the awakening comes, in times, the consequence, suicide or recovery. In itself, awareness is something sickening about it. Here I must conclude that it is good, but everything begins with a consciousness and nothing is worth anything except through it. There is nothing original about these remarks, but they are obvious. That is enough for a while. During a sketchy reconnaissance in the origins of the absurd, mere anxiety, as Heidegger says, it is at the source of everything. Likewise, and during every day of an unillustrious life, time carries us, but a moment always comes when we have to carry it. Will live on the futures. Tomorrow, later on, when you have made your way, you will understand when you are old enough. Such irrelevances are wonderful, for after all, it's a matter of time. Yet a day comes when a man notices or says that he is thirsty. He is 30. Thus he asserts he is youth, but simultaneously he situates himself in relation to time. He takes his time in it. He admits that he stands at a certain point on a curve that he acknowledges having to travel to its ends. He belongs to time, and by the honor that sees him, he recognizes his worst enemy, tomorrow. He was longing for tomorrow, whereas everything in him ought to reject it. That revolt of the flesh is absurd, uh, but not in the proper sense. This is not a definition, but rather an enumeration of the feeling that may admit of the absurd. Still, enumeration finished, the absurd has nevertheless been exhausted. Okay. A step lower and strangeness creeps in, a perceiving that the world is tense, sensing to what a degree a stone is foreign and irreducible to us, with what intensity nature or a landscape can negate us. At the heart of all beauty lies something inhuman, and these hills, the softness of the sky, the outline of the trees, at this very minute lose the illusory meaning with which we had clothed them. Henceforth, more remote than a lost paradise, the primitive hostility of the world arises up to appraise us across millennia. For a second, we cease to understand it because for centuries we have understood in it solely the image and the design that we had attributed to it beforehand. Because henceforth we lack the power to make use of the artifice
The world evades us because it becomes it becomes itself again. That stage scenery masked by the habit becomes again what it is. It withdraws it at a distance from us, just as there are days when under the familiar face of a woman we see as a stranger her, we had loved months or years ago. Perhaps we shall come even to desire what suddenly leaves us so alone. But the time has not yet come. Just one thing, the denseness and the strangeness of the world is the absurd. Okay, let me think about it. Do we have any meaning in life? Simple, is it okay? Men do secret the inhuman at certain points, so at certain moments of lucidity. The mechanical aspect of their gesture, the meaning pantomimes to make silly everything that surrounds them. So the man is talking on the telephone behind a glass partition. So you cannot hear him, but you see his incomprehensible dumb show. You wonder why he is alive. This discomfort in the face of a man's own inhumanities, this incalculable tumble before the image of what we are. This nausea, as the writer of today calls it, it is also the absurd. Likewise, the strangers who at certain seconds comes to meet us in a mirror, and the familiar and yet alarming brother when we encounter us in our own photographs is also the absurd. I come at the last to death and to the attitude we have towards it. On this point, everything has been said, and it is only proper to avoid pathos. Yet one will never be sufficiently surprised that everyone lives as if no one knew. This is because in reality there is no experience of death. Properly speaking, nothing has been experienced but what has been lived and made conscious. Here it is barely possible to speak of the experience of others' death. It is a substitute, an illusion, and it never quite convinces us. That melancholy convention cannot be persuasive. The horror comes in reality from the mathematical aspect of the events. If time frightens us, this is because it works out the problems and the solution comes afterwards. All the pretty speeches about the soul will have their contrary convincingly proved, at least for a time. From this insert body on which a slap makes no mark, the soul had disappeared. This elementary and definitive aspect of the adventure constitute the absurd feeling under the fatal lightning of that destiny. It's useless becomes evident. No code of ethics and no effort are justifiable priori in the face of the cruel mathematics that commands our condition. Let me repeat it. All this has been said over and over. I'm limiting myself here to making a rapid classifications and to pointing out these obvious themes. They run through all literatures and all philosophies. Everyday, conversation feeds on them. There is no question of reinventing them, but it is essential to be sure of these facts in order to be able to question oneself subsequently on the primordial questions. I'm interested. Let me repeat again. Not so much in absurd discoveries as in their consequence. If one is assured of these facts, what is one to conclude? How far is one to go to elude nothing? Is one to die voluntarily or to hope in spite of everything? Beforehand, it is necessary to take the same rapid inventory of the plane of the intelligence. The mind's first step is to distinguish what is true from what is false. Okay, what is true and what is false? I mean, who gets to decide it? The mind's first step is to distinguish what is true from what is false. However, as soon as thought reflects on itself, what it first discovers is a contradictions, too useless to strive to be convincing in this case. Over the centuries, no one has furnished a clearer and more elegant demonstration of the business than Aristotle. The often ridiculed consequence of this opinion is that they destroy themselves. For by asserting that all is true, we assert the truth of the contrary assertion and consequently the falsity of our own thesis. For the contrary assertion does not admit that it can be true. And if one says that all is false, that assertion is itself false. If we declare that the solely the assertion proposed to us is false, or else that solely ours is not false, we are nevertheless forced to admit an infinite numbers of true or false judgment. For the one who expresses a true assertion proclaims simultaneously that it is true, and so on ad infinitum. This vicious circle is but the first of a series in which the mind that studies itself gets lost in a giddy whirling. The very simplicity of these paradoxes makes them irreducible. Whatever may be the place on the words and the acrobatics of logic, to understand is above all to unify. The mind is deepest desire, even in even its most elaborate operations, parallels man's unconscious feeling in the face of this universe. It is an insistence upon familiarity, an appetite for clarity. Understanding the world for a man is reducing it to the human, stamping it with its seal. The cat's universe is not the universe of and heel. The truism, all thought is anthropomorphic, has no other meaning. Likewise, the mind that aims to understand reality can consider itself satisfied only by reducing it to terms of thoughts. If a man realized that the universe like him can love and suffer, he would be reconciled. If thought discovered in the shimmering mirror of the phenomenon eternal relation, a relation capable of summing them up and so summing themselves up in a single principle, then we would be seen as an intellectual joy of what the myth of the blessed would be but a ridiculous imitations. The nostalgia for unity, that appetite for the absolute, illustrates the essential impulses of a human drama. But the fact of but the fact of the nostalgia existing does not imply that it is to be immediately satisfied. For if bridging the gulf that separates desire from the conquest, we assert with paramount nights the reality of the one, whatever it may be. We fall into the ridiculous contradictions of a mind that asserts total unity and proves by its very assertion its own differences and the diversity it claimed to resolve. This other vicious circle is enough to stifle our hopes. So again, truism, I shall again repeat that they are not interesting in themselves, but in the consequence that can be reduced from them. I know another truism. It tells me that the man is and the man is mortal. It tells me that man is mortal. One can nevertheless count the minds that have gives the extreme conclusion from it. It is essential to consider as a constant point of reference in this essay that the regular hiatus between what we fancy we know and what we really know, practical assurance and simulated ignorance, which allows us to live with ideas which, if we truly put them to the test, ought to upset our whole life. Faced with these inextricable contradictions of mind, we shall fully grasp the divorce separating us from our own creation, so long as the mind keeps silent in the motionless world of its whole. Everything is reflected and arranged in the unity of its nostalgia, but with its first move, this world cracks and tumbles, and infinite numbers of shimmering fragments is offered to the understanding. We must despair of ever reconstructing the familiar, calm surface which would give us a peace of heart. After so many centuries of inquiries, so many abdication among thinkers, we are well aware that this is true for all our knowledge, with the exception of professional rationalists. And today, people despair of a true knowledge. If the only significant history of the human thought were to be written, it would have to be the history of its successive regrets and its importance, of whom and of what I indeed can I say. I know that this heart within me I can feel and I can I judge that it exists. This world I can touch and I likewise judge that it exists. It ends all my knowledge and the rest is construction. For it, if I try to seize this self of which I feel sure, if I try to define and to summarize it, it is nothing but a water slipping through my finger. I can sketch one by one all the aspect and is able to assume all those likewise that have been attributed to it. This upbringing, this origin, this ardor of this silence, this nobility or this violence, that aspect cannot be added up. This very heart which is mine will forever remain indefinable to me between the certainty I have of my existence and the content I try to give up to the assurance. The gap will never be filled. Forever I shall be a stranger to myself. In psychology, as in logic, there are truths but no truths. There are truths but no truth. Okay, there are truths but no truth. Socrates, know yourself, has as much value as the be virtuous of our confessionals. They reveal a nostalgia at the same time as an ignorance. They are sterile exercise on great subjects. They are legitimate only in precisely as so far as they are approximate. And here are trees, and I know the current land, surface water, and I feel its taste. The scent of a grass and stars at night, certain evening when the heart relaxes. How shall I negate this world whose power and strength I feel? Yet all the knowledge on earth will give me nothing to assure me that this world is mine. You describe it to me and you teach me to classify it. You enumerate its lost and in my thirst for knowledge I admit that they are true. You take part its mechanisms and my hope increases. At the final stage you teach me that this wondrous and multicolored universe can be reduced to the atom and that the atom itself can be reduced to the electron. All this is good and I wait for you to continue, but you tell me of an invisible planetary system in which electrons gravitates around a nucleus. You explain this world to me with an image. I realize then that you have been reduced to poetry. I shall never know. Have I the time to become indignant? You've already changed theories, so that science that was to teach me everything ends up in a hypothesis that lucidity founders in a metaphor that uncertainty is resolved in a work of an art. What need had I of so many efforts? The soft lines of these heels and the hand of evening or this troubled her touch in her heart teach me much more. I have returned to my beginning. I realize that if through science I can seize phenomena and enumerate them, I cannot for all that apprehend the world. Were I to trace its entire relief with my finger, I should not know any most. And you give me the choice between description that is sure, that teaches me nothing, and hypothesis that claim to teach me but that are not sure. A stranger to myself and to the world, armed solely with the thought that negates itself as soon as it asserts. What is this condition in which I can have peace only by refusing to know and to live? In which the appetite for conquest bumps into walls that defy its assault? The will is to stir up paradoxes. Everything is ordered in such a way as to bring into being that poison to peace produced by the thoughtlessness, lack of heart, or fatal renunciation. Hence, the intelligence too tells me in its way that this world is absurd. Its contrary, blind reasons, may well claim that all is clear. I was waiting for proof and longing for it to be right. But despite so many pretentious centuries and over the heads of so many eloquent and persuasive men, I know that it's false. On this plane, at least, there are no happiness if I cannot know that universal reasons, practical or ethical, that determinisms, those categories that explains everything, are enough to make a decent man laugh. They have nothing to do with the mind. They negate its profound purpose, which is to be enchained in this unintelligible and limited universe. Man's fate henceforth assumes its meaning. A horde of irrationals has sprung up and surrounds him until his ultimate ends. In his recovered and now studied lucidity, the feeling of the absurd becomes clear and definite. I say that the world is absurd, but I was too hasty. This world in itself is not reasonable. That is all that can be said. But what is absurd is the confrontation of this irrational and the world and the wild longing for clarity. Those call echoes in the human heart. The absurd depends as much as on man as on the world. For the moment, it is all that link them together. It binds them one to the other as only hatred can weave two creatures together. This is all I can discern clearly in this measureless universe where my adventure takes place. Let us pause here. If I hold to be true that absurdity that determines my relationship with life, if I become thoroughly imbued with that sentiment that seizes me in face of the worst scenes, with that lucidity imposed on me by the pursuit of science, I must sacrifice everything to the certainties, and I must see them squarely to be able to maintain them. Above all, I must adapt my behavior to them and pursue them in all their consequence. I'm speaking here of decency, but I want to know beforehand if thought can live in those deserts.
I already know that thought has at least entered those deserts. There it found its bread. There it realized that it had previously been feeding on phantoms. It justified some of the most urgent themes of human reflections. From the moment absurdity is recognized, it becomes a passion, the most harrowing of all. But whether or not one can live with one's passions, whether or not one can accept the loss, which is to burn the heart they simultaneously exalt, that is the whole question. It is not, however, the one we shall ask just yet. It stands at the centers of this experience. There will be time to come back to it. Let us recognize rather those themes and those impulses born of the desert. It will suffice to enumerate them. They too are known to all today. They've always been meant to defend the rights of the irrationals. The traditions of what may be called humiliated thought has never ceased to exist. The criticisms of rationalism has been made so often that it seems unnecessary to begin again. Yet our epoch is marked by the rebirth of those paradoxical systems that strive to strip us the reason as if truly it had always forged ahead. But that is not so much of proof of the efficacy of the reasons of the intensity of its own. On the plane of history, such a constancy of two altitudes illustrates the essential passions of a man torn between his urge towards unity and the clear vision he may have of the walls enclosing him, but never perhaps at any time has the attack on reasons been more violent than in us. Since Zarathus's great outburst, perchance it is the oldest nobility in the world. I conferred it upon all the things when I proclaimed that above them no eternal will be exercised, will was exercised. Since Kierkegaard's, it's fatal illness, that malady that leads to death with nothing else following it. The significance and tormenting theme of absurd thought have followed one another, or at least, and this proviso is of capital importance. The theme of irrationals and religious thoughts, from Jasper to Heidegger's, from Kierkegaard's to Chestov's, from the phenomenologist to Skeller, on the logical plane and on the moral plane. A whole family of mind relates by the nostalgia but opposed by their methods or their aims, have persisted in blocking the royal roads of the reasons and in recovering the direct parts of the truths. Here I am, here I assume these thoughts to be known and lived. Whatever may be or have been their ambitions, all started out from that indescribable universe where contradictions, antimony, anguish are important rinsed, and what they have in common is precisely the theme so far disclosed. For them too, it must be said that what matters above all is the conclusion they have managed to draw from those discoveries, that matters so much that they must be examined separately. But for the moment, we are concerned solely with their discoveries and their initial experiments. We are concerned solely with noting their agreements, if it would be presumptuous to try to deal with their philosophies. It is possible and sufficient in any case to bring out the climate that is common to them. Heidegger considers the human condition coldly and announces that the existence is humiliated. The only reality is anxiety in the whole chain of beings. To the man lost in the world and its diversions, this anxiety is a brief, fleeting fear. But if that fear becomes conscious of itself, it becomes anguish and perpetual climate of the lucid man in whom existence is concentrated. This professor of philosophy writes without trembling and in the most abstract language in the world that the finite and limited characters of human existence is more primordial than man itself. Himself, his interest in Kant's extend only to the recognizing the restricted character of his pure reasons. This is to conclude at the end of his analysis that the world can no longer offer anything to the man filled with the anguish. This anxiety seems to him so much more important than all the categories in the world that he thinks and talks only of it. He enumerates its aspect, boredoms when the ordinary man strives to quash it in him and benumb it, terror when the mind contemplates death. He too does not separate consciousness from the absurd. The consciousness of death is the call of the consciousness of death is the call of anxiety, and existence then delivers itself its own summons through the intermediary of the consciousness. It is very voice of anguish, and it adjures existence to return from its loss to the anonymous state. From him too one must not sleep, but must keep alert until the consummation. He stands in this absurd world and points out its ephemeral characters. He seeks his way amid these realms. Jasper's despair of any ontology because he claims that we have lost naivety. He knows that we can achieve nothing that will transcend the fatal games of appearance. He knows that the end of the mind is a failure. He tarries over the spiritual adventures revealed by the history and pitilessly discloses the flaws in its system. The illusion that saved everything, the preaching that hid nothing in this ravaged world in which the impossibility of knowledge is established, in which everlasting nothingness seems the only reality and irredeemable. Despair seems the only attitude. So he tries to recover the Arianian thread that leads to divine secret. Chesto, for his part, throughout a wonderfully monotonous work, constantly straining towards the same truths, tirelessly demonstrate that the tightest system, the most universal rationalisms, always stumble eventually on the irrationals of human thoughts. None of the ironic facts or ridiculous contradiction that depreciate the reason escapes him. One thing only interests him, and that is the exception, whether in the domain of the heart or of the mind. Through the Dostoevsky's experiences of the condemned man, the exacerbated adventure of the Nations of mind, Hamlet's imprecations or bitter aristocracy of an Elsman. It writes down, illuminates, and magnifies the human revolt against the irremediable. He refuses the reason its reasons and begins to advance with some decision only in the middle of that colorless desert where all certainties have become storms. Of all, perhaps the most engaging, Kierkegaard's, for a part of his existence at least, does more than the discoveries that are absurd he lives in. The man who writes, the surest of stubborn silence is not to hold one's tongue, but to talk. The surest of stubborn silence is not to hold one's tongue, but to talk. Makes sure in the beginning that no truth is absolute, or can render a satisfactory an existence that is impossible in itself.
John, Don John of the understanding, he multiplies pseudonyms and contradictions, writes his discourse of edifications at the same time as the manual of a cynical spiritualism, the diary of the seducers. He refuses consolation, ethics, reliable principle. As for that thorn he feels in his heart, he is careful not to quiet its pain. On the contrary, he awakens it, and in the desperate joy of a man crucified and happy to be so, he builds up piece by piece, lucidity, refusal, make believe, a category of the man possessed that face both tender and sneering. Those pyrutes, followed by a cry from the heart, are the absurd spirit itself grappling with the reality beyond its comprehension, and the spiritual adventure that leads Kierkegaard's to his beloved scandal begins likewise in the kiosk of an experience divested of its setting and relegated or to its original incoherence. On the quite a different plane, that of a method, Husserl and the phenomenologist, by their very extravagance, reinstate the world in its diversity and deny the transcendent power of the reasons. The spiritual universe becomes incalculably enriched through them. So the rose petal, the milestone, or the human hands are as important as love, desire, or the laws of gravity. Thinking ceases to be unifying or making a semblance familiar in the guise of a nature principle. Thinking is learning all over again to see, to be attentive, to focus consciousness. It is turning every idea and every image in the manner of a Proust into a privileged moment. What justifies thought is its existence, its extreme consciousness, though more positive than Kierkegaard's or Chester's, whose Rail's manner of proceeding in the beginning nevertheless negates the classic methods of the reasons, disappoints hope, or opens to intuition and to the heart of whole proliferations of phenomena, the wealth of which has about it something inhuman. These paths lead to all signs or to move to none. So this amounts to saying that in this case, the means are more important than the end. All that is involved is an attitude for understanding and not a consolation. Let me repeat in the beginning at the very least. Let me repeat in the very beginning, at very least. How can one fail to feel the basic relationship of these minds? How can one fail to see that they take their stance around a privileged and bitter moment in which hopes has no further place? I want everything to be explained to me or nothing. And the reason is important when if the reason is important when it hears this cry from the heart. The mind arose by this insistence seeks and finds nothing but contradictions and nonsense. What I fail to understand is nonsense. The world is people with such irrationals. The world itself with whose single meaning I do not understand is but a vast irrational. If one could only say just once, this is clear, all would be safe. But this men vie with one another in a proclaiming that nothing is clear, all is chaos, that all man has his lucidity and his definitive knowledge of the world surrounding him. All this experience agrees and confirms one another. The mind, when it reaches its limit, must make a judgment and choose its conclusion. This is where suicide and the reply stands. But I wish to reverse the order of the inquiry and start out from the intelligent and adventure and come back to daily acts. The experience called to mind here, we were born in the desert that we must not leave behind. At least it is essential to know how far they went. At this point of his effort, man stands face to face with irrationals. He feels within him his longing for happiness and for reasons. The absurd is born of this confrontation between the human need and the unreasonable silence of the world. I repeat, the absurd is born of these confrontations between the human needs and the unreasonable silence of the world. This must not be forgotten. This must be clung to because the whole consequence of a life can depend on it. The irrational, the human nostalgia, and the absurd that is born of the encounters. These are the three characters in the drama that must necessarily end with all the logic of which an existence is capable. Absurdism, okay, nihilism, existentialism. Now, philosophical suicide. Philosophical suicide, I think it is, I'm not exactly sure. Okay, it could be talking about the fact that you completely turn off your rational mind and you just completely turn off and then just believe in a faith. That means believe in a religion, and which is not proven scientific. So yeah, philosophical suicide. So first he talks about the suicide, the physical suicide, and he says that that is a coward way of doing it. Second, you turn to religion. That means a philosophical suicide. The feeling of the absurd is not for all that. The notion of the absurd, it lays the foundation for it, and that is all. It is not limited to that notion, except in the brief moment when it passes judgment on the universe. Subsequently, it has a chance of going further. It is alive. In other words, it must die or else reverberate. So it is with the theme we have gathered together, but there again, what interests me is not works or minds, criticisms of which would call for another performs in another place, but the discovery of what their conclusion have in common. Never perhaps have mind been so different, and yet we recognize as identical the spiritual landscapes in which they get underway. Likewise, despite such dissimilar zones of knowledge, the cry that terminates their itinerary rings out in the same way. It is evident that the thinkers we have just recalled have a common climate. To say that the climate is deadly, deadly scarily amounts to playing on words, to living under its, stifling sky force one to get away or to the stay. The important thing is to find out how people get away in the first case and why people stay in the second case. This is how I define the problem of suicide and the possible interest and the conclusion of the existential philosophy. But first, I want to detour from the direct path. Up to now, we have managed to circumscribe the absurd from the outside. We can, however, wonder how much is clear in that notion, and by direct analysis, try to discover its meaning on the one hand, and on the consequences it involves. If I accuse an innocent man of a monstrous crime, if I tell a virtuous man that he had coveted his own sister, he will reply that this is absurd. His indignation has its comical aspect, but it also has its fundamental reasons. The virtuous man illustrates by that reply the definitive antinomy existing between the deed I am attributing to him and his lifelong principles. It's absurd means it's impossible, but also it's contradictory. If I see a man armed only with a sword attack a group of machine guns, I shall consider his act to be absurd, but it is so solely by virtue of the disproportionate between his intention and the reality he will encounter, of the contradictions I notice between this true strength and the aim he has in view. Likewise, we shall esteem a verdict absurd when we contrast it with the verdict the fact apparently dictates, and similarly, a demonstration by the absurd is achieved by comparing the consequence of such a reasoning with the logical reality one wants to set up. In all these cases, from the simplest to the most complex, the magnitude of the absurdity will be in direct ratio to the distance between the two terms of my comparisons. They are absurd marriages, challenges, ransaws, silences, vast, and even peace treaties. For each of them, the absurdity springs from a comparison. I am thus justified in saying that the feeling of absurdity does not spring from the mere scrutiny of a fact or an impression, but that it bursts from the comparison between the bare fact and a certain reality, between an action and the world that transcends it. The absurd is essentially a divorce. It lies in neither of the elements compared. It is born of their confrontations. In this particular case, and on the plane of intelligence, I can therefore say that the absurd is not in man, if such a metaphor could have a meaning, not in the world, but in their presence together. For the moment, it is the only bond uniting them. If I wish to limit myself to facts, I know what man wants, I know what the world offers him, and now I can say that I also know what links them. I have no need to dig deeper. A simple certainty is enough for the seekers. He simply has to derive all the consequence from it. Okay, I want to know what is the exact definition of absurd. So when you say that it's absurd, right? Absurd means it's possible, it's impossible. And that's not possible, okay? Absurd, ABSU. Absurd meaning. What is the exact definition of it? Absurd means completely unreasonable, illogical, or ridiculous. It describes something that goes against common sense or is so remarkably silly that it invites laughter or disbelief. It's absurd. Refers to theater of an absurd or existentialism. In this context, it means the conflict in the human searching for meaning. Okay, it's absurd, not logical. Okay, yeah, it's illogical, basically. The immediate consequence is also rule of methods. The odd trinity brought to light in this way is certainly not a startling discovery, but it resembles the data of inexperience in that it is both infinitely simple and infinitely complicated. Its first distinguishing feature in this regard is that it cannot be divided. To destroy one of its terms is to destroy the whole. There can be no absurd outside the human mind. Thus, like everything else, the absurd ends with the death. but there can be no absurd outside this world either, and it is by this elementary criterion that I judge the notion of the absurd to be essential and consider that it can stand as the first of my truth. The rule of method alluded to above appears here. If I judge that if I judge that a thing is true, I must preserve it. If I attempt to solve a problem, at least I must not by that very solution conjure away one of the terms of the problem. For me, the sole datum is the absurd. The first and after all, the only condition of my inquiry is to preserve the very thing that crushes me. Consequently, to respect what I consider essential in it, I have just defined it as a confrontations and unceasing struggles. And carrying this absurd logic to this conclusion, I must admit that the struggle implies a total absence of hope, which has nothing to do with the despair, a continued rejections, which must not be confused with the renunciations, and a conscious dissatisfaction, which must not be compared with immature unrest. Everything that destroys, conjures away, or exorcises its requirements, and to begin with the consent which overthrows reversed, ruins the absurd, and to devalue the attributes, and that may be then proposed. The absurd has meaning only insofar as it is not agreed to. I mean, I have to tell you, it's quite deep, man. I don't think I have the intellectual capacity currently to understand 100%, but to some extent, I do get what he's trying to say, but not 100%. The absurd has meaning only insofar as it is not agreed to. The absurd has meaning only insofar as it is not agreed to. There exists an obvious fact that seems utterly moral, namely that a man is always a prey to his truths. There exists an obvious fact that seems utterly moral, namely that a man is always prey to his truth. Once he has admitted them, he cannot free himself from them. One has to pay something. A man who has become conscious of the absurd is forever bound to it. A man devout of hope and conscious of being so has ceased to belong to the future. That is natural, but it is just as natural that he should strive to escape the universe of which he is the creator. All the foregoing has significance only on accounts of this paradox. Certain men, starting from a critique of rationalisms, have admitted that the absurd climate, nothing is more intrusive in this regard than to scrutinize the way in which they have elaborated their consequence. Now, to limit myself to existential philosophies, I see that all of them without exception, suggest escape through an odd reasoning, starting out from the absurd over the ruins of reason in a closed universe limited to the human. They defy what crushes them and find reasons to hope in what improvises them. That first hope is religion. That first hope is religious in all of them. It deserves attention. I shall merely analyze here an example of few themes dear to Chesterton and Kierkegaard, but Jaspers will provide us in caricatural form a typical example of this attitude. As a result, the rest will be clearer. He is left powerless to realize the transcendence, incapable of plumbing the depth of the experience and conscious of that universe is set by failure. Will he advance or at least draw the conclusion from that failure? He contributes nothing new. He has found nothing in experience but the confession of his own importance and no occasion to infer any satisfactory principle. Yet without justification, as he says to himself, he suddenly asserts all at once the transcendence, the sense of the sense of experience and the superhuman significance of the life when he writes. Does not the failure reveal beyond any possible explanations and interpretations to interpretation, not the absence but the existence of transcendence? The existence which suddenly and through a blind act of human confidence explains everything. It defines as the unthinkable unity of the general and the particular. Thus an absurd becomes a god in the broadest meaning of this word, and that inability to understand becomes the existence that eliminates everything. Nothing logically prepares this reasoning. I can call it a leap, and paradoxically can be understood Jasper's insistence, his infinite patience devoted to making the experience of the transcendence impossible to realize. This is for the moment fleeting that approximation is, the more empty the definition proves to be, and the more real the transcendence is to him. But the passion that he devotes to asserting it is in direct proportion to the gap between his powers of explanation and the irrationality of the world and of any experience. It thus appears to that the more bitterly Jasper destroys the preconceptions, the more radically he will explain the world. That apostle of humiliated through it will find it at the very end of the humiliation, the means of regenerating being to its very depth. Mystical thoughts has familiarized us with such a device. They are just as legitimate as any attitude of the mind. But for the moment, I'm acting as if I look at certain problems to a later stage without judging beforehand the general value of this attitude of its educative power. I mean, simply to consider whether answers the condition I've set myself, whether it is worthy of the conflict that concerns me. Thus, I return to the chest of a commentator relates a remark of his that deserves interest. The only true solution, he said, is precisely where human judgment sees no solution. Otherwise, when what we need, otherwise, what need would have, otherwise, what need would we have of God? We turn towards God only to obtain the impossibles. As for the possibles, the men suffice. If there is a Chestovian philosophy, I can say that it is altogether summed up in this way. For when at the conclusion of his passionate analysis, Chestov discovers the fundamental absurdity of all existence. He does not say this is the absurd, but rather this is God. We must rely on him even if he does not correspond to any of our rational categories, so that confusion may not be possible. But the Russian philosophers even hints that this God is perhaps full of hatred and hateful, incomprehensible and contradictory. But the more hideous is his face, the more he asserts his power. His greatness is his incoherence. His proof is his inhumanity. One must spring into him and by leap free oneself from rational illusions. Thus, for the Chestov's acceptance of this absurd is contemporaneous with the absurd itself. Being aware of it amounts to accepting it, and the whole logical effort of this thought is to bring it out so that at the same time the tremendous hope it involves may burst forth. Let me repeat that this attitude is legitimate, but I am persisting here in considering a single problems and all its consequences. I do not have to examine the emotion of a thought or of an act of a faith. I have a whole lifetimes to do that. I know that the rationalist finds Chestov's attitudes annoying, but I also feel that Chestov is right rather than the rationalist, and I merely want to know if he remains faithful to the commandments of the absurd. Now, if it is admitted that the absurd is the contrary of a hope, it is seen that existential thoughts for Chestov presupposes the absurd but proves it only to dispel it. Such subtlety of thought is a conjurer's emotion trait. When Chestos elsewhere sets his absurd in opposition to current morality and reason, he calls it truth and redemption. Hence there is basically in the definition of an absurd and appropriations that Chestov grants it. If it is admitted that all the powers of the notion is lies in the way it runs counters to our elementary hopes, if it is felt that to remain the absurd requires not to be consented to, then it can be clearly seen that it has lost its true aspect, its human and relative characters, in order to enter an eternity that is both incomprehensible and satisfying. If there is an absurd, it is in man's universe. The moment the notion transforms itself into eternity's springboard, it ceases to be linked to the human lucidity. The absurd is no longer that evidence that man's ascertain without consenting to it. The struggle is eluded. Man integrates the absurd, and in that communion causes to disappear its essential characters, which is opposition, laceration, and reversed. This leap is an escape. Chestov, who is so fond of quoting Hamlet's remark, the time is out of joint, writes it down with a sort of a savage hope that seems to belong to him in particular, for it is not in this sense that Hamlet says it or Shakespeare writes it. The intoxications of the irrational and the vocation of rapture turn a lucid mind away from the absurd. To Chestov, reason is useless, but there is something beyond reasons. To an absurd mind, reason is useless. To an absurd mind, reason is useless, and there is nothing beyond reason. This leap can at least enlighten us a little more as to the true nature of the absurd. We know that it is worthless except in an equilibrium, that it is above all in the comparisons and not in terms of that comparison. Okay, okay. Even in absurdism, he said there is a okay. But it is so happens that Chestov puts all the emphasis on one of the terms and destroys the equilibrium. Our appetite for understanding, our nostalgia for the absolute are explicably only insofar, precisely, as we can understand and explain many things. It is useless to negate the reason absolutely. It has its orders in which it's efficacious. It is properly that of a human experience. Whence we wanted to make everything clear. If we cannot do it, if we cannot do so, if the absurd is born on that occasion, it is born precisely at the very meeting point of that efficacious but limited reasons when the ever resurgent irrational. Now, when Chestos rise up against a Hegelian proposition such as the motion of the solar system takes place in the conformity with immutable laws, and those laws are his reasons. When he devotes all his passion to upsetting Spinoza's rationalisms, he concludes in effect in favor of the vanities of the all reasons, whence by natural and illegitimate reversal to the preeminence of the irrationalist. but the transition is not evident. For here, many intervenes the notion of the limit and the notion of levels. The laws of the nature may be operative, but to a certain limits beyond which they turn against themselves to give birth to the absurd, or else they may justify themselves on the level of the descriptions without further reasons being true on the level of explanation. Everything is sacrificed here to irrationals, and the demand for clarity being conjured away. The absurd disappears with one of the terms of its comparisons. The absurd man, on the other hand, does not undertake such a leveling process. He recognizes the struggle and does not absolutely scorn reasons and admits the irrationalist. Thus, he again embraces in a single glance at all data of experience, and he is little inclined to leap before knowing. He knows as simple that in that alert awareness there is no further place for hope. What is perceptible in Leo Chestov's will be perhaps even more so in Kierkegaard's. To be sure, it is hard to outline clear propositions in so elusive a writer, but despite apparently opposed writings, beyond the pseudonyms, the trick and the smiles can be felt throughout the work, as it were. The presentiments at the same time, it has the prehensions of a truth which eventually burst forth in the last words. Kierkegaard likewise takes the lead. His childhood having been so frightened by the Christianist, he ultimately returns to its harshest aspect. For him, to antimony and paradox becomes criteria of the religions. It's the very thing that led to the despair of the meaning and depth of his life now gives its truth and its clarity. Christianity is the scandal, and what Kierkegaard calls for quite plainly is that third sacrifice required by the Ignatius Loyola, the one in which God must rejoice, the sacrifice of the intellects. The effect of the leap is so odd, but must not surprise us any longer. He makes of the absurd the criterions of the other world, whereas it is simply a residue of the experience of this world. In his failure, says Kierkegaard, the believer finds his triumph. It is not for me to wonder to what steering preaching this attitude is linked. I merely have to wonder if the spectacle of the absurd and its own character justifies it. On this point, I know that it is not so. Upon considering again the content of the absurd, one understands better that the method that inspired Kierkegaard's between the irrationals of the world and the insurgent nostalgia of the absurds. He does not maintain the equilibrium. He does not respect the relationship that constitutes, properly speaking, the feeling of absurdity, sure of being unable to escape the irrationals. He wants at least to save himself from that desperate nostalgia that seems to him sterile and devoid of implication. But if he may be right on his point in his judgment, he could not be in his negation. If he substitutes for his cry of revolt a frantic adherence, at once he is led to blind himself to the absurd which hitherto enlighten him and to defy and only a certain and he henceforth possesses the irrations. The important thing, as Abby Galena said to in Epiphany, is not to be cured but to live with one's ailments. Kierkegaard wants to be cured. To be cured is his frenzied wish, and it runs throughout his whole journal. The entire efforts of his intelligence is to escape the antinomy of the human conditions, and all the more desperate effort since he intermittently perceives its vanity when he speaks of himself, as if in neither fear of God nor piety were capable of bringing him to peace. Thus, it is that through a strained subterfuge, he gives the irrational the appearance and God the attributes of the absurd and just incoherence and incomprehensible. Intelligence alone in its stripes to stifle the underlying demands of the human heart. Since nothing is proved, everything can be proved. Since nothing is proved, everything can be proved. Indeed, Kierkegaard himself shows us the path taken. I do not want to suggest anything here, but how can one fail to read in his works the signs of an almost intentional mutilations of the soul to balance the mutilations accepted in regard to the absurd? It is the leitmotif of the journal. What I lacked was the animal which also belongs to the human destiny, but gives me a body then. And further on, oh, it is merely okay. Just where was I? Oh, next page. Especially in my early youth, what I should not have given to given to be a man, even for 6 months. What I lack basically is a body and a physical condition of existence. Elsewhere, the same man, nevertheless, adopts the great cry of hope that he has come down through so many centuries and quickened so many hearts, except that of the absurd man. But for the Christians, death is certainly not the end of everything, and it implies infinitely more hope than life implies for us. And even when that life is overflowing with health and vigor, reconciliation through scandal is still reconciliation. It allows one, perhaps, as can be seen, to derive hope of its contrary, which is death. But even if fellow feeling incline one towards that attitude, still it must be said that excess justifies nothing. The transcends, as the saying goes, the human scale, therefore it must be superhuman. But this, therefore, is superfluous. There is no logical certainty here. There is no experimental probability either. All I can say is that, in fact, the transcends my scale. If I do not draw any negation from it, at least I do not want to find anything on the incomprehensible. I want to know whether I can live with what I know and with that alone. I am told again that here the intelligence must sacrifice its pride and the reasons bow down. Why do you have to sacrifice your intelligence? But if I recognize the limits of the reasons, I do not therefore negate its recognizing its relative power. I merely want to remain in this middle path where the intelligence can remain clear. If that is, if that is its pride, and I see no sufficient reason for giving it up. Nothing more profound, for example, than Kierkegaard's views, according to which a despair is not a fact but a state. The very state of sin, for sin is what alienates from God. The absurd, which is the metaphysical state of the conscious man, does not lead to God. Perhaps this notion will become clearer if I risk this shocking statement: the absurd is sin without God. Perhaps this notion will become clearer if I risk this shocking statement: the absurd is sin without God. It is a matter of living in that state of absurd. I know on which, I know on what it is founded. This mind and this world straining against each other without being able to embrace each other. I ask for the rule of the rule of life of that state, and what I am offered neglects its basis, negates one of the terms of the painful oppositions, demands of me a resignation. I ask what is involved in the condition. I recognize as mine. I know it implies obscurity and ignorance, and I'm assured that this ignorance explains everything, and that this darkness is my light. But there is no reply here to my intent, and this steering lyricisms cannot hide the paradox from me. One must therefore turn away. Kierkegaard may shout in warning: if man had no eternal consciousness, if at the bottom of everything there were merely a wild seeing force producing everything both large and trifling in the storm of our dark passions, if the bottomless void that nothing can fill underly all things, what would life be but despair? This cry is not likely to stop the absurd man. Seeking what is true is not seeking what is desirable. If, in order to elude the anxious questions, what would life be, one must, like the donkey, feed on the roses of illusion, then the absurd mind, rather than resigning itself to falsehood, prefers to adopt fearlessly, Kierkegaard's reply: despair. Everything considered, a determined soul will always manage. I'm taking the liberty at this point of calling the existential attitude philosophical suicide. Okay, what? I'm taking the liberty at this point of calling the existential attitude. Existential means no purpose in life, but you have to make your own purposes. A physician, philosophical suicide, but why? But this does not imply a judgment. It is a convenient way of indicating the movement by which a thought negates itself and intends to transcend itself in its very negations. For the existential negation, it is their God. To be precise, that God is maintained only through the negations of human reasons. But like suicides, God's change with men. So there are many ways of leaping the existent and essential being to leap. Those redeeming negations, those ultimate contradictions which negates the obstacle that has not yet been leaped over, may spring just as well. This is the paradox at which this reasoning aims. From a certain religious inspiration as from the rational orders, they always lay claim to the eternal, and it's slowly in this that they take the leap. I do not say exclude gods, which would still amounts to asserting. Let me assert again, it is not the affirmation of a God that is questioned here, but rather the logic leading to that affirmation. Let me assert again, it is not the affirmation of a God that is questioned here, but rather the logic leading to it. Just wait, and assertion. An assertion is an emphatic statement, claim, or declaration that someone strongly believes it to be true, often presented as a fact without immediate or supporting evidence. In everyday language, it is a declaration made forcefully as a part of an argument. It acts as a synonym for a claim or a contention. She rejected his assertion that the project was a failure. Okay, but does it mean this is a statement that says you are truly, that you strongly believe that something is true? The action of showing, using, or stay, statements. Words in simple words. Assertion is a strong, confident statement declaring that something is true. It is used to present a fact or opinions, even if it hasn't been completely proven yet. It must be repeated that the reasoning developed in the essay leaves out altogether the most widespread spiritual attitudes of our enlightened age, the one based on the principle that all is reasons, which aims to explain the world. It is natural to give a clear view of the world after accepting the idea that it must be clear. That is even legitimate, but does not concern the reasoning we are following out here. In fact, our aim is to shed light upon this step taken by the mind when, starting from a philosophy of the world's lack of meaning, it ends only by finding a meaning and depth in it. The most touching of those steps is religions in its sense. It becomes obvious in the theme of the irrationals, but the most paradoxical and the most significant is certainly the one that attributes rational reasons to the world it originally managed as devoid of any guiding principle. It is impossible in any case to reach the consequence that concerns us without having given an idea of this new attainment of the spirit of nostalgia. I shall examine merely the theme of the intention, made fashionable by Husserl and the phenomenologist. I have already alluded to it. Originally, Husserl methods, originally Husserl's methods negates the classic procedures of the reason. Let me repeat: thinking is not unifying or making the appearance familiar with the guise of a great principle. Thinking is learning all over again how to see, directing one's consciousness, making of every image a privileged place. In other words, phenomenology declines to explain the world. It wants it to be merely a description of the actual experience. It confines absurd thought in its initial assertion that there is no truths, but merely truths. Okay, that means there is no truth. That means there's no single truth. There are many truths. Okay. I repeat, it confirms absurd thought in its initial assertion that there is no truth, but merely truths. From the evening breeze to this hand on my shoulders, everything has its own understanding. It merely focuses. It is the act of attention, and to borrow a Birdsonian image, it resembles the projectors that certainly focuses on an image. The differences is that there is no scenario, but a successive and incoherent illustration. In that magic lantern, all the pictures are privileged. Consciousness suspends and experience the object of its satisfaction in attention. Through its miracle, its isolation, them henceforth they are beyond all judgment. That is the intention that characterizes consciousness. But the word does not imply any idea of finality. It is taken in its sense of directions. It only values its topographical. At first sight, it certainly seems that in this way nothing contradicts the absurd spirit, the apparent modesty of thoughts that limits itself to describing what it declines to explain. That intentional discipline invents results paradoxically a profound enrichment of experience and the rebirth of the world in its prolixity are absurd procedures, at least at first sight, for methods of thoughts, in this case as elsewhere, always assume two aspects, one psychological and the other metaphysical. Thereby, they harbor two truths. If the theme of the intention claims to illustrate merely a psychological attitudes, by which reality is drained instead of being explained, nothing in fact separates it from the absurd spirit. It aims to enumerate what it cannot transfer. It affirms solely that without any unifying principle, thought can still, take delight in describing and understanding every aspect of experiences. The truth involved then for each of those aspects is psychological in nature. It simply testifies, to the interest the reality can offer. It is a way of awaking a sleep world and of making it vivid to the mind. But if one attempts to extend and give a rational basis to that notion of a truth, if one claims to discover in this way the essence of each object of knowledge, one restores its depth to experience. For an absurd mind that is incomprehensible. Now it is this wavering between modesty and assurance that is noticeable in the intentional attitudes, and this shimmering of phenomenological thought will illustrate the absurd reasoning better than anything else. For Husserl speaks like spice of an extra-temporal essence brought to light by the intention, and he sounds like a Plato. All things are not explained by one thing, but by all things. All things are not explained by one thing, but all things. All things are not explained by one thing, but all things. I see no differences. Okay, just wait. I see no differences. To be sure, those ideas or those essence that consciousness effectuates at the end of very descriptions are not yet to be considered perfect models, but it is asserted that they are directly present in each, direct terms of perception. There is no longer a single idea explaining everything, but in infinite numbers of essence, giving a meaning to an infinite numbers of object. The world comes to stop, but also lights out. Platonic realism becomes intuitive, but it is still realism. Kierkegaard was swallowed up in his god. Pyramid Knights plunged through, though into one. But here, thoughts hurl itself into an abstract polytheism. But it is not all hallucinations and fictions. Likewise, belongs to extratemporal systems. In the new world of ideas, the species of Centros collaborators, collaborates with the more immodest species, species of metropolitan, metropolitan men. For the absurd man, there was a truth as well as a bitterness in that purely psychological opinion that all aspects of the world are privilege. To say that everything is a privilege is a tantamount to saying that everything is equivalent. But the metaphysical aspect of that truth is so far reaching then that through an elementary reaction he feels closer perhaps to Plato. He is taught, in fact, that every image presupposes an equally privileged essence. In this ideal world without hierarchy, the formal army is supposed solely of the generals. To be sure, transcendency had been eliminated, but a certain shift in thought brings back into the world as sort of a fragmentary eminence which restores to the universe its depth. Am I to refer having carried too far a theme handled with a greater circumspections by its creators? I read merely these assertions of Husserl, apparently paradoxical yet rigorously logical if what precedes is accepted. That which is true is truly absolute, okay? That which is true absolutely in itself. Truth is one, identical with itself, however different the creatures who perceive it. Men, monsters, angels, or gods. Reason triumphs and trumpets forth with that voice. I cannot deny what can its assertion mean in the absurd world. The perception of an angel or a god has no meaning for me. That geometrical spot where divine reason ratifies mine will always be incomprehensible to me. There too I discern a leap, and though performed in the abstract, it nonetheless means for me forgetting just what I do not want to forget. When farther on Husserl exclaims, if all masses subject to attractions were to disappear, the law of attractions would not be destroyed but would simply remain without any possible applications. I know that I am faced with the metaphysics of consolations, and if I want to discover that point where thought leaves the path of evidence, I have only to reread the parallel reasoning that Husserl voices regarding the mind. If we could contemplate clearly the exact laws of physics, psychic process, they would be seen to likewise eternal invariables, like the basic laws of theoretical natural science. Hence, they would be valid even if there were no psychic process. Even if the mind were not, its law would be. I see then that of psychological truths. Husserl aims to make a rational rules. After having denied the integrating power of human reasons, he leaps by this expedient to eternal reasons. Husserl's a theme of the concrete universe cannot then surprise me if I am told that all the essence are not formal, but that some are material. That the first are the object of logic and the second of science. This is merely a question of definition. The abstract, I am told, indicates but a part without consistency in itself of a concrete universal, but the wavering already noted allows me to throw light on the confusion of those terms. For that may mean that the concrete object of my attention, the sky, the reflection of water on this court, alone preserves the prestige of the real that my interest isolates in the world, and I shall not deny it. But that may mean also that this court itself is universal, has its particular and sufficient essence, belongs to the world of forms. I then realized that merely the order of the processions has been changed. This world has ceased to have its reflection in a in high universe, but the heaven of forms is figured in the host of image of this earth. This changes nothing for me, rather than encountering here a taste for the concrete, the meaning of the human conditions. I find an intellectualism sufficiently unbridled to generalize the concrete itself. If it is futile to be amazed by the apparent paradox that leads thought to its own negation by the opposite path of humiliated reasons and triumphal reasons, from the abstract god of Husserl to the dazzling god of Kierkegaard, the distance is not so great. Reasons and the irrational lead to the same preaching. In truth, the way matters but the little. That in truth the way matters but little, the will to arrive suffice. The abstract philosophers and the religious philosopher starts out from the same disorder and support each other in the same anxiety, but the essential is to explain. Nostalgia is stronger here than knowledge. It is significant that that the thought of the epoch is at once of the most deeply imbued with the philosophy of the non-significance of the world and one of the most divided in its conclusion. It is constantly oscillating between extreme rationalizations of reality, which tends to break up that thought into standard reasons, and its extreme irrationalization, which tends to defy it. But this divorce is only apparent. It is a matter of reconciliations, and in both cases, the leap suffices. It is always wrongly thought that the notion of reason is a one-way notion. To tell the truth, however rigorous it may be in its ambition, this concept is nonetheless just as unstable as others. Reason bears a quite human suspect, but it also is able to turn towards the divine. Since Plutonium's, who was the first to reconcile it with the eternal climate, it has learned to turn away from the most cherished of its principles, which is contradictions, in order to integrate into the strangest, the quite magic on one of participation. It is an instrument of a thought, and not it is an instrument of thought and not thought itself. Above all, a man's thought is his nostalgia. Just as reason was able to soothe the melancholy of Plotinus, it provides modern anguish the means of calming itself in the familiar settling of the eternal. The absurd mind has less love, for it the world is neither so rational nor so irrational. It is unreasonable and only that. With Husserl, the reasons eventually has no limits at all. The absurd, on the contrary, establishes its limits since it is powerless to claim its anguish. Kierkegaard independently asserts that a single limit is enough to negate that anguish, but the absurd does not go so far. For that, that limit is directed solely at the reason's ambitions. The theme of the irrational, as it is conceived by the existentials, is reasons becoming confused and escaping by negating itself. The absurd is lucid reasons not noting its limits. Only at the end of this difficult path does the absurd mean in a man recognizes his true motives. Upon comparing his inner exigence and what is then offered him, he suddenly feels he is going to turn away. In the universe of Husserl, the world becomes clear, and that longing for familiarity that man's heart harbors becomes useless. In Kierkegaard's apocalypse, that desire for clarity must be given up if it wants to satisfy. If it wants to be satisfied, sin is not so much knowing. If it were, everybody would be innocent as wanting to know. Indeed, it is the only sin of which absurd man can feel that it constitutes both his guilt and his innocence. He is offered a solution in which all the past contradictions have become merely a polemical games, but this is not the way he experienced them. Their truth must be preserved, which consists in not being satisfied. He does not want preaching. My reasoning wants to be faithful to the evidence. Okay. Okay, my reasoning wants to be faithful to the evidence that arose it. That evidence is the absurd. It is that divorce between the mind that desires and the world that disappoints. My nostalgia for unity, this fragmented universe and the contradiction that binds them together. Kierkegaard suppresses my nostalgia, and Husserl gathers together the universe. That is not what I was expecting. It was a matter of a living and thinking with those dislocations, of knowing whether one had to accept or refuse. There can be no question of masking the evidence, of suppressing the absurd by denying one of the terms of its equation. It is essential to know whether one can live with it or whether, on the other hand, logic commands one to die of it. I'm not interested in a philosophical suicide, but rather in a plain suicide. I merely wish to purge it of its emotional contents and know its logic and its integrity. Any other position implies for the absurd mind deceit and the mind's retreat before what the mind itself has brought to light. Husserl claims to obey the desire to escape, the inveterate habit of living and thinking it certain, well known, and convenient condition of existence. But the final leap restores in him the eternal and its comfort. The leap does not represent an extreme danger as Kierkegaard would like to do it. The danger, on the contrary, lies in the subtle instant that precedes the leap, being able to remain on that dizzying crest. That is integrity, and the rest is subterfuge. I know also that never happened. That never has helplessness inspired such a striking. I know also that never has helplessness inspired such striking harmonies as those of the Kierkegaards. But if helplessness has its place in the indifferent landscape of history, it has none in a reasoning whose exigence is not known. Absurd freedom. Absurd freedom. I think this is what the Albert, uh, Camus, I think he followed absurd freedom, not the suicide, physical suicide, and second philosophical suicide, but rather the freedom, absurd freedoms. Now the main thing is done. I hold certain facts from which I cannot separate. but I know what is certain, that what I cannot deny, what I cannot reject. This is what counts. I can negate everything of that part of me that lives on awake nostalgia, except this desire for unity, this longing to solve, this need for clarity and the cohesions. I can refute everything in this world surrounding me that offends or enraptures me, except this chaos, this sovereign chance, and this divine equivalence which spring from the anarchy. I don't know whether this world has a meaning that transcends it, but I know that I do not know that meaning, and that it is impossible for me just now to know it. What can a meaning outside my condition mean to me? I can understand only in human terms. What I touch, what resists me, that is what I understand. And these two are certainties. My appetite for the absolute and for the unity and impossibility of reducing this world to a rational and reasonable principle. I also know that I cannot reconcile them. What other truth can I admit without lying, without bringing in a hope I lack, and which means nothing within the limits of my conditions? If I were a tree among trees, a cat among animals, if I were a tree among trees, a cat amongst animals, this life would have a meaning, or rather, this problem would not arise. For I should belong to this world. I should be this world to which I am now opposed by my whole consciousness and my whole insistence, purpose. I also kind of actually remembered where I was watching a video of Sadhguru, and he was talking about the fact that there should not be any purpose in anyone's life. The purpose is for things. For example, this pen has a purpose. This laptop has a purpose. This book has a purpose. This house has a purpose. This building has a purpose. This car has a purpose to serve. The car to just to take one place from others, and the human, they don't have any purposes. And I also know about some people who says that there's no purposes, but the purpose is to find that purpose. That's weird, right? The purpose is to find the purpose, and if there's no purpose, then what is the purpose we're finding? So there is no purpose. Okay, I don't know. What others, what other truth? I also know what I cannot reconcile them. So what other truth can I admit without lying, without bringing in a hope I lack, and which means nothing within the limit of my conditions? If I were a tree among trees, okay, all those things done. I should be this world to which I am now opposed by my whole consciousness and my whole insistence upon familiarity. This ridiculous reason is what sets me in a position to also creation. I cannot cross it out with a stroke of a pen. What I believe to be true, I must therefore preserve. What seems to me so obvious, even against me, I must support. And what constitutes the basis of that conflict, of that break between the world and my mind, but the awareness of it. If therefore I want to preserve it, I can through a constant awareness, ever revived, ever alert. This is what for the moment I must remember. At this moment, the absurd, so obvious and yet so hard to win, returns to a man life and find its home there. At this moment too, the mind can leave the arid, dried up path of lucid efforts to the path now emerge in a daily life. It can counters the world of the anonymous impersonal pronoun one, but henceforth man enters in its in it with its revolt and his lucidity. He has forgotten how to hope. This hell of the present is in his kingdom at last. A problem recover their sharp edge, abstract evidence to it retreat before the poetry of forms and colors. Spiritual conflict becomes embodied and return to the abject and magnificent shelters of a man's heart. None of them is settled, but all are transfigured. Is one going to die, escape by leap, rebuild a mansion of the ideas and forms to one's own scale? Is one, on the contrary, going to take up the rending and marvelous wages of the absurd? Let's make a final effort in this regard and draw all our conclusions. The body, affections, creation, action, human mobility will then resume their places in this mad world. At last, man will again find the wine of the absurd and the bread of the indifferences on which he feed his greatness. Let us insist again on the method. It is a matter of a persisting. At a certain point on his path, the absurd man is tempted. History is not lacking in either religion or prophets. Even without gods, he is asked to leave. All he can reply is that he doesn't fully understand, that it is not obvious. Indeed, he does not want to do anything but what he fully understands. He is sure that this is the sin of a pride, but he does not understand the notion of a sin, that perhaps hell is in store, but he has not enough imagination to visualize that strange future, that he is losing immortal life, but that seems to him an ideal consideration. An attempt is to, an attempt is made to get him to admit his guilt. He feels innocent, to tell the truths. That is all he feels. His his irreparable innocence. This is what allows him everything. Hence, what he demands of himself is to live solely with what he knows, to accommodate himself to what is, and to bring him, to bring in nothing that is not certain. He's told that nothing is but this at least, but this at least is certainable, and it is with this that he is concerned. He wants to find out if it is possible to live without appeal. Now I can broach the notion of suicide. It has already been felt with what solution might be given. All this At this point, the problem is reversed. It was previously a question of finding out whether or not life had to have a meaning to be lived. It now becomes clear, on the contrary, that it will be lived all the better if it has no meaning. Living an experience, a particular fate, is accepting it fully. Now, no one will live his fate knowing it to be absurd, unless he does everything to keep him that absurd brought to light by consciousness, negating one of the terms of the opposition on which he lives. His lives, he lives amounts to escaping it. To abolish conscious revolt it waits, to elude the problems. The theme of the permanence of revolution is thus carried into individual experience. Living is keeping the absurd alive. Keeping it alive is above all contemplating it. Unlike erudized, the absurd dies only when we turn away from it. One of the only coherent philosophical position is thus revolt. It is a constant confrontation between a man and his obscurity. It is an insistent upon an impossible transparency. It challenges the world anew every second, just as danger provided man the unique opportunity of seizing awareness. No metaphysical revolt extends awareness to the whole of experience. It is that constant presence of mind in his own side. It is not aspiration, for it is devoid of hope. That revolts is the certainty of a crushing fate without the resignation that ought to accompany it. This is where it is seen to what a degree absurd experience is remote from the suicide. It may be thought that suicide follows revolt. Suicide follows revolt, but wrongly, for it does not represent the logical outcome of revolt. It is just the contrary by the consent it presupposes. Suicide, like the leap, is acceptance, and it at its extreme, everything is over, and man returns to his essential history. His future is unique and dreadful futures. He sees and rushes towards it. In its way, suicide settles the absurd. It engulfs the absurd in the same depth. But I know that in order to keep alive, the absurd cannot be settled. It escapes suicide to the extent it is simultaneously aware and rejection of it. It is at the extreme limits of the condemned man's last thought, that shoelace, and that despite everything he sees a few yards away, on the very brink of his drizzling fall. The contrary of a suicide, in fact, is the man condemned to death. That revolt gives life its value, spread out over the whole length of a life. It restores its majesty to that life, to a man devoid of blinders, that there is no finer side than that of the intelligence that grips with a reality that transcends it. The side of a human pride is unequaled. No disparagement, disparagement is of any use. The discipline that the mind imposes on itself, that will conjure up out of nothing, that face-to-face struggle have something exceptional about them. To improvise that reality whose inhumanity constitutes the man's majesty is tantamount to improvising him in him himself. I understand that why the doctrine that explain everything to me also delibates me at the same time. They relieve me of the weight of my own life, and yet I must carry it alone. And this at this juncture, I cannot conceive that a skeptical metaphysics can be joined to an ethics of renunciation. Consciousness and revolt, these rejections are the contrary of renunciation. Everything that is domitable and passionate in a human heart quickens them. So on the contrary, with its own life, it is essential to die unreconciled and not of one's own free will. Suicide is a reputation. The absurd man can only drain everything to the bitter ends and depletes himself. The absurd is his extreme tension, which he maintains constantly by solitary efforts. For he knows that in that consciousness and to day-to-day revolt, he gives proof of his own efforts, which is defines that is the first consequence. If I remain in the that prearranged position, which consists in drawing all the conclusions and nothing else, involved in a newly discovered notion, I am faced with a second paradox. In order to remain faithful to that method, so I have nothing to do with the problems of metaphysical liberty. Knowing whether or not a man is free doesn't interest me. I can experience only by my own freedoms, as to say, I can have no general notions, but merely a few clear sights. To the problems of freedom as much has no meaning, for it is linked to in quite different way with the problems of God. Knowing whether or not man is free involves knowing whether he can have a master. The absurdity peculiar to this problem comes from the fact that the very notion that makes the problem of freedom possible also takes away all its meaning. For in the presence of God, there is less a problem of freedom than the problem of evil. The alternative: either we are not free and God, all the power, is responsible for evil, or we are free and responsible, but God is not all the powerful all the scholastic subtleties have neither added anything nor subtracted anything from the acuteness of this paradox. This is why I cannot get lost in the glorification or the mere definition of a notion which eludes me and loses its meaning as soon as it goes beyond the frame of reference of my individual experience. I cannot understand what kind of a freedom would be given me by a higher beings. I've lost the sense of hierarchy. The only conceptions of freedom I have is that of the prisoners or the individual in the midst of a state. The only one I know is freedom of thought and actions. Now, if the absurd cancels all my chances of eternal freedoms, it restores and magnifies, on the other hand, my freedom of actions. The privations of hope and future means, an increase in man's availability. Before encountering the absurd, the everything, the everyday man lives with aim, a concern for the future, so for justification with regards to whom or what is now the questions. He weighs his chances. He counts on someday his retirement or the labor of his sons. He still thinks that something in his life can be directed. In truth, he acts as if he were free, even if all the facts makes a point of contradicting that liberty. But after that, but after the absurd, everything is subset. That idea that I am my way of acting as if everything has a meaning, if even if okay, an occasion I said nothing has, all that is given the lie in vertiginous fashions by the absurdity of a possible death. Thinking of the future, establishing aim for oneself, having preferences, all this presupposes a belief in freedoms, even if one occasionally assertion that one doesn't feel it. But at the moment, I'm well aware that that higher liberty, the freedom to be, which alone can serve as a basis for the truth, doesn't exist. Death is there as the only reality. After that, the chips are down. I am not even free either to perpetuate myself, but a slave, and above all, a slave without hope of an eternal revolution, without recourse to contempt, and who without revolution and without contempt can remain a slave. What freedom can exist in the fullest sense without assurance of eternity? But at the same time, the absurd man realizes that hitherto he was bound to that postulate of freedoms from the illusion of which he was living, in a certain sense that hampered him. To the extent to which he might imagine a purpose to his life, he adapted himself to the demands of the purpose to be achieved and became the slave of his liberty. Thus, I could not act otherwise than as the father or the engineers or the leaders of the nations or the post office clerk that I am preparing to be. I think I can choose to be that rather than something else. I think so unconsciously, to be sure. But at the same time, I strengthen my postulate with the belief of those around me, with the presumptions of my human environment. Others are also, others are so sure of being free, and that cheerful mood is so contagious. However far one may remain from my presumptions, moral or social, one is partly influenced by them, and even for the best among them, there are good and bad presumptions. One adapts one's life to them. Thus, the absurd man realizes that he was not really free. To speak clearly, to the extent to which I hopes, to which I revert about a truth that might be individual to me, about a way of being or creating, to the extent to which I rearrange my life and prove thereby that I accept it's having a meaning. I create for myself a barrier between which I confine my life. I do not. I do like so many bureaucrats of the minds and hearts. So only only who fills me with disgust and who's only wise. I now clearly is to take man's freedom seriously. The absurd enlightens me on this point. There is no future, henceforth, this is the reasons for my inner freedoms. I shall use two comparison here. Mystics, to begin with, find freedom in giving themselves, by losing themselves in their gods, by accepting his rules, by they become secretly free and spontaneously accept it, slavery, they recover a deeper independence. But what does that freedom mean? It may be said, above all, that they feel free with regard to themselves and not so much free as liberated, like was completely turned towards death and taken here as the most obvious absurdity. The absurd man feels released from everything outside the passionate attention, crystallizing in him. He enjoys the freedom with regard to common rules. It can be seen at this point that the initial themes of existential philosophy keeps their entire value. The return to consciousness, the escape from everyday sleep represent the first steps of absurd freedoms, but it is existential preaching that is alluded to, and with it, that spiritual leap, with it basically escapes consciousness. In the same way, this is my second comparison. The slaves of antiquity did not belong to themselves, but they knew that freedom which consisted in not feeling irresponsible. Death too has patriation's hands which, while crushing, also liberate. Losing oneself to that in that bottomless certainty, feeling henceforth sufficiently remote from one's own life to increase it, take a broad leave of it. This involves the principle of liberation. Such view new independence has a definite time limits. Like any freedoms of action, it does not write a check on eternity, but it takes the place of the illusions of freedoms, which all stopped with the divine availability of the condemned man before whom the prison doors open in a certain early downs, that unbelievable disinterestedness with regard to everything except for the pure flame of life, it is clear that death and the absurd are here, the principles of the only reasonable freedoms that which a human here can experience and live. This is the second consequence. The absurd man thus catches sight of the burning and frigid, transparent, limited universe in which nothing is possible, but everything is given, and beyond which all is collapsed and nothingness. He can then decide to accept such a universe and draw from it his strength, his refusal to hope, and the unyielding evidence of life without consolation. I am concerned here with a factual comparisons, not with an apology of humility. The absurd man is the contrary of a reconciled man. But what does life mean in such a universe? Nothing else for the moment but indifferences to the future and desire to use up everything that's given. Believe in the meaning of life always implies a scale of values, a choice of preferences. Believe in the absurd, according to our definitions, teaches the contrary, but it is worth examining. Knowing whether or not one can live without appeal is all that interests me. I do not want to get out of my depth. This aspect of life given or life being given me, can I adapt myself to it? Now, faced with this particular concern, believe in the absurd is tantamounts to substituting the quantity of experience for the quality. If I convince myself that this life has no other aspect than that of absurd, if I feel that its whole equilibrium depends on that perpetual opposition between my conscious revolt and the darkness in which it struggles, if I admit that my freedom has no meaning except in the relation to its limited fate, then I must say that what counts is not the best living, but in the relation to its this one counts is not the best thing living, but the most living. It is not up to me to wonder if this is vulgar or revolting, elegant or deplorable. Once and for all, value judgments are discarded here in favor of the factual judgment. I have merely to draw the conclusion from what I can see and to risk nothing that is hypothetical. Supposing that living in this way we were not honorable, then true propriety could command me to be dishonorable. The most living, in the broadest sense, that rules means nothing. It calls for definitions. It seems to begin with the fact that the notion of quantity has not been sufficiently explored, but it can account for a large share of human experience. A man's rule of conduct and his scale of values have no meaning except through the quantity and variety of experience he has been in a position to accumulate. Now, the condition of a modern life imposed on the majority of the men the same quantity of experience and consequently the same profound experience. To be sure, taken they must also be taken into consideration the individual spontaneous contribution, the given element in him, but I cannot judge of that. And let me repeat that my rule here is to get along with the immediate evidence. I see then the individual characters of a common code of ethics lies not so much in the ideal importance of its basic principles as in the norm of an experience that is possible to measure. To stretch a point somewhat, the Greeks had the code of their ledger just as we have the code of our 8 hours a day. But already many men among the most tragic cause us to foresee that a longer experience changes their staple of values. They make us imagine that adventure of the everyday who through mere quantity of experience would break all the records. I'm purposely using this sports expression and would thus win his own choice code of ethics. Yet let's avoid romanticism and just ask ourselves what such an attitude may mean to a man with his mind made up to take up his bet and to observe strictly what he takes to be the rules of the game. Breaking all the records is first and foremost being faced with the world as often as possible. How can that be done without contradictions and without playing our own words? For on the one hand, the absurd teaches that all the experiences are important, and on the other hand, on the other, it urges towards the greatest quantity of experiences. And how then can one fail to do, as so many of those men I was speaking of earlier, choose the form of life that brings us the most possible of that human matters, thereby introducing a scale of values that, on the other hand, on one claims to reject. But again, it is the absurd and its contradictory life that teaches us. For the mistake is thinking that quantity of experience depends on the circumstances of our lives, that when it depends solely on us, here we have to be oversimple. The two men living the same numbers of years, the world always provides the same sum of experience. It is up to us to be conscious of them, being aware of one's life, one's revolt, one's freedoms, and to use the maximum as living and to the maximums, where lucidity dominates, the scale of value becomes useless. And let's be even more simple. Let us say that the sole obstacle, the sole deficiency to be made good is to constitute by premature death. That no depth, no emotion, no passion, no sacrifice could render equal in the eyes of the absurd man, even if we wished it so. A conscious life of 40 years and lucidity spread over 60 years. Madness and death are his irreparables. Man does not choose. The absurd and the extra life it involves, therefore, do not depend on a man's will. But on its contrary, what is death? Weighing words carefully, it is altogether a question of luck. One just has to be able to consent to this. There will never be any substitute for 20 years of life and experience. But what is an odd inconsistency in such an alert race? The Greeks claim that those who died young were beloved of the gods, and that is true only if you are willing to believe that entering the ridiculous world of the gods is forever losing the purest of joy, which is feeling and feeling on this earth. The present and the succession of present before a constantly conscious soul is the ideal of the husbandman, but the word ideal rings falls in the connections. It is not even his vocations, but merely the third consequence of his reasoning, having started from an anguish awareness of the inhuman. The meditations on the absurd returns at the end of its itinerary to the very heart of the passionate flames of the human revolt. Thus, I draw from the absurd three consequences, which are my revolt, my freedom, and my passion. My revolt, my revolt, my passion, and my freedom. By the mere activity of consciousness, I transformed into a rule of life what was an invention to death, and I refuse suicide. I know, to be sure, the dull resonance that vibrates throughout the stage, yet I have but a word to say that it is necessary when Nietzsche writes, it clearly seems that the chief thing in heaven and on earth is to obey at length and in a single direction. In the long run, there results something for which it is worth the trouble of living on this earth, as, for example, virtue, art, music, the dance, the reasons, and the mind, something that transfigures something delicate, mad, or divine. He elucidates the rule of a rarely distinguished code of ethics, but he also points the way of the absurd man. Obeying the flame is both the easiest and the hardest thing to do. However, it is good for a man to judge himself occasionally. He is alone in the being able to do so. Prayer, says Allen, is when night descends over thought, but the mind must meet the night, may reply the mystics and the existentialists. Yes, indeed, but not the night that is born under the closed eyelids and through the mere will of the man, dark, impenetrable night that the mind calls upon in order to plunge it away. If it must encounter a night, let it be rather than of a despair which remains lucid. Polar night, vigil of the mind, whence will arise perhaps that white and virginal brightness which outlines every object in the light of the intelligence. At that degree, equivalence encounters passionate understanding. That is, then it is no longer even a question of the judging the existential leap. It resumes its place and amid the old age fresco of human attitudes. For the spectators, if he is conscious that leap is still absurd, it is insofar as he thinks, it solves the paradox, it reinstates its intact. On this score, it is steering. On this course, everything resumes its place and the absurd world is reborn in all its splendor and diversity. But it is bad to stop. Okay, just wait. Same reflection on the notion of as different as the ideas of eternal nothingness. It either adds, it neither adds anything nor subtracts anything from reality. In a psychological experience of nothingness, it is by the consideration of what will happen in 2000 years when that our own nothingness truly takes on meaning. In one of its aspects, eternal nothingness is made up by precisely of the sum of the lives to come, which will not be ours. The will is only the agent here. It tends to maintain consciousness. It provides a discipline of life, and that is appreciable. What matters is coherence. We start out here from acceptance of the world, but Oriental thought teaches that one can indulge in the same effort of logic by choosing against the world. That is just a legitimate and give this essay its perspective and its limits. But when the negation of the world is pursued just as rigorously, one often achieves in certain Vedantic school similar result regarding, for instance, the indifferences of work. In a book of great importance, Laysock's, Jane Grenier establishes in his way a variety of philosophical emphasis. But it is bad to stop, hard to be satisfied with with a single way of seeing, to go without contradiction, perhaps the most subtle of all spiritual forces. The preceding merely refines a way of thinking, but the point is to live. The gods had condemned. The point is to live. The preceding merely, okay. The gods had condemned Sisyphus to ceaselessly rolling. Okay, the god has condemned Sisyphus to ceaselessly, rolling a rock to the top of a mountain, whence the stone would fall back of its own weight. They had thought with some reason that there is no more dreadful punishment than futile and hopeless labor. If one believes Homer, Sisyphus was the wisest and the most prudent of mortals. According to another traditions, however, he was disposed to practice the professions of a highwayman. I see no contradictions in this. Opinions differ as to the reasons why he became the futile laborer of the wonderworld. To begin with, he is accused of a certain levity in regard to the gods. He stole their secrets. Gima, the daughter of the Sisyphus, was carried off by Jupiter. The father was shocked by that disappearance and complained to the Sisyphus. He who knew of the abductions offered to tell about it on one condition, that Sisyphus would give water to the citadel of the Corinth. Corinth is the place where Sisyphus is the king. To the celestial thunderbolts, he preferred the benefactions of the water. He was punished for this in the underworld. Homer tells us also that Sisyphus had put death in chains. Pluto could not endure the slight of of his deserted, silent empire. He dispatched the god of war, who liberated death from the hands of his conqueror. It is said that Sisyphus, being near to death, rashly wanted to test his wife's love. He ordered her to cast his unburied body into the middle of the public square. Sisyphus woke up in the underworld, and there, annoyed by an obedience so contrary to human loves, he obtained from Plato a permission to return to earth in order to, chastise his wife. I don't get it. What? It is said that Sisyphus, It is said that Sisyphus, being near to death, rashly wanted to test his wife's love. He ordered her to cast his unburied body into the middle of the public square. Sisyphus woke up in the underworld, and there, annoyed by an obedience so contrary to the human love, he obtained from Pluto permission to return to the earth in order to chastise his wife. But when he had seen again the face of this world, enjoyed water and suns, warm stones in the sea, he no longer wanted to go back to that infernal darkness. Because signs of anger, warning were of no avail. Many years more he lived, facing the curve of the gulf. The sparkling sea and the smiles of the earth. A decree of the gods was necessary. Mercury came and seized the impudent man by the collar, and snatching him from his joys, lead him forcibly back to the underworld, where his rock was ready for him. You have already grasped that Sisyphus is the absurd hero. He is as much through his passion as through his torture. He is scorn of the gods. His hatred of death and his passion for life warn him that unspeakable penalty in which the whole being is exerted towards accomplishing nothing. This is the price that must be paid for the passion of the earth. Nothing is told to us about Sisyphus in the underworld. Myths are made for the imagination to breathe life into them. As for this myth, one sees merely the whole effort of a body straining to raise the huge stone, to roll it and push it up the slope 100 times over. One sees the face screwed up, the cheek tight against the stone, the shoulder bracing the clay cover, masses the foot wedging it, the fresh start with the arm outstretched, the wholly human security of a two earth clotted hands. At the very end of this long efforts to measure by the skyless space and time without depth, the purpose is achieved. Then Sisyphus watches the stone rush down in a few moments towards that lower world, whence he will have to push it up again towards the summit. He goes back to the plane. Okay, I'll just do some researching. What is that whence? It's a colloquial English, I think. Okay, whence. How do I pronounce it? Whence. Whence. Whence is a formal, old-fashioned word meaning from where or from what sources or cause. Okay, from where. From where. Okay, from where. It's a whence. 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 Whence means from where. It's a ing. Anant Ranganathan on Sisyphus. Sisyphus. A scientist on, I think he's okay. This one's okay. In Greek mythology, there's a video.
Sisyphus was a Greek character who cheated death, and that incensed the Greek gods so much that they cursed him. And they said every morning you would wake up and you would push a rock up a hill, and by evening that rock would be on top of a hill and the rock would tumble down. And the next morning you would pick that rock up and push it again, and you would do it till eternity.
Eternity.
And he said we are all Sisyphuses. We are all pushing a rock.
So you're saying that we are all Sisyphus.
Somebody is physically pushing a rock, somebody is comfortable while pushing it.
Okay, this is what I like about his example, right? Because when he says that everybody is a Sisyphus, that means everybody is, waking up doing that thing again and again and then sleeping back. No, but there are some people who are doing it. But there are some people who are doing it with a force. That means they have to do it because they don't have any other option. But there are some people who are using some machines to do it. For example, given an example, I think he might give an example. Let's see.
Somebody is using a crane to push it.
Yeah, so he's giving an example of a crane, right? Somebody's using a crane to push the rock. I mean, he's talking basically about those people who have a lot of resources, the wealthy people. So, all in all, everyone is doing it, but the only difference is that some people are doing it physically through heartful, but some people are doing it, with help of resources. But the fact is that everyone is doing it.
Every morning we do the same thing, push a rock, and every night, and it's so true.
Okay, so but a metaphor of the boulders, Rangananda often uses Sisyphus not merely as a victim of a cruel, never-ending curse, but as an emblem of continuous daily perseverance. Okay, excellent choices. Okay, I think he must have. There is but one truly, serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Rangananda has drawn parallels to the real tragedy in India. For instance, he applied, Camus' philosophical lens to Clyde. Okay, just wait. Okay, article. I think he must have. Uh, is there any article by Anand Rangan on Sisyphus? Yes, Anand Rangan has written an article that heavily features the myth of this. We can read this article, please. This too. Personal website, the slum that must not be burned. Okay, let's see. There is but one truly a serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Okay, and there's an article also. I will try to read it. Okay, where was I? I went to search what I forgot, man. I went to search about the meaning of whence, from where. Okay, it is during that return, that pause, that Sisyphus interest me. A face that toils so close to stone is already stone itself. I see that man going back down with a heavy yet measured step towards the torment of which he will never know the ends. That hour, like a breathing space, which returns as surely as his suffering. That is the hour of consciousness. At each of those moments when he leaves the heights and gradually sinks towards the layers of the gods, he is superior to his fate. He is stronger than his rock. If this myth is tragic, that is because its hero is conscious. Where would this torture be? Indeed, if at every step the hope of succeeding upheld him, to the workman of today's work, everybody, every day in his life at the same task, and his fate is no less absurd. But it is for tragic only at the rare moments when it becomes conscious. Sisyphus, a proletarian of the gods, powerless and rebellion, knows the whole extent of his wretched conditions. It is what he thinks of during this descent, the lucidity that was to constitute his torture, at the same time crowns his victory. There is no fate that cannot be surmounted by this crown. It is, if the descent is thus sometimes performed in sorrow, it can also take place in joy. This word is not too much. Again, I fancy Sisyphus returning towards his rock, and the sorrow was in the beginning, when the image of the earth clinging too tightly to memory, when the call of happiness becomes too insistent. It happens that melancholy arises in the mind's heart. This is where the rock's victory. This is the rock itself. The boundless grief is too heavy to bear. These are nights of the Gethsemane, but crushing truths perish from the being knowledge. Thus, Oedipus is the outset obeys fate without knowing it. But from the moment he knows, his strategy begins. Yet at the same moment, blind and desperate, he realizes that the only bound linking him to the world is the cool hand of a girl. Then a tremendous remark rings out. Despite so many ordeals, to my advanced age and the nobility of my soul takes me to conclude that all is well. So falls Oedipus. Like Dostoevsky's, Kirillov thus gives the recipe of the absurd victory. Ancient wisdom confirms modern heroism. One does not discover the absurd without being tempted to write a mere manual of voice. Happiness, what by such another ways? There is but one world. However, happiness and the absurd are two of the same. Okay, so he says that there is but one world. However, happiness and the absurd are two sons of the same world. They are inseparable. It would be a mistake to say that happiness necessarily springs from the absurd discovery. That it happens as well as that the feeling of the absurd springs from the happiness. I conclude that all is well, says Oedipus, and that remark is sacred. It echoes in the wild and limited universe of a man. It teaches that all has not been exhausted. It drives out of this world a god who had come into with a dissatisfaction and preference for futile suffering. It makes of fate a human matter which must be settled amongst men. All Sisyphus' silent joy is contained therein. His fate belongs to him. His rock is a thing likewise. The absurd man, when he contemplates his torment, his silence of all the idols, in the universe certainly restored to his silence. The myriad wandering little voices of the earth rise up, unconscious secret calls, invitation from all the faces. They are the necessary reversed and price of the victory. There is no sun without a shadow. There is no sun without a shadow, and it is essential to know the night. The absurd man says yes, and his effort will henceforth be unceasing. If there is a personal fate, there is no higher tendency in destiny, or at least there is, but one which he concludes is inevitable and despicable. For the rest, he knows himself to be the master of the days. At that subtle moment when the man glances backwards over his life, Sisyphus returning toward his rock, in that slight pivoting, he contemplates a series of unrelated actions which he becomes his fate, created by him, combined under his memory eye, and soon sealed by death. Thus, convinced of the wholly human origin of all that is a human, a blind man eager to see who knows that the night has no end, he still goes on, he's still on the go, the rock is still rolling. I leave Sisyphus at the foot of the mountain. One always finds one burden again, but Sisyphus teaches the higher fidelity that negates the gods and the raises rock. He too concludes that all is well. This universe henceforth without a master seems to him neither sterile nor futile. Each atom of that stone, each mineral flake of that night-filled mountains in itself forms a world. The struggle itself towards the height is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. I don't get this, okay? Okay, I'll just go and search it. At the end, he says that one must imagine Sisyphus happy. What does that mean? One must imagine, okay? What does this mean? Why should we imagine? Okay, yeah, that's what I'm saying. Why should we imagine Sisyphus happy? I'm going to Reddit and I got something answer. Why should we imagine Sisyphus happy? Imagine Sisyphus happy contradicts, in my opinion. Imagining Sisyphus happy contradicts, in my opinion, the absurdist philosophy. He was condemned by a higher being to perform the same task over and over again, sort of a meaning. People are not, for example, the absurd life of John Donne, like as Camus describes him, represents freedom of a choice and experience pleasures. Imagining Sisyphus happy seems to me to be a kind of extreme optimism, blindness and absence of rebellion. It seems like justification of slavery or being slave. I would love to be proven wrong. Sisyphus got into trouble because he was a smartass, because he outwitted the gods. He literally chained up death and rendered him useless. In doing so, Sisyphus defied death and ensured himself many extra years of life. To punish him, the goddess sentenced him to ask, I know this one. By being happy, the gods wanted him to be miserable. By being happy, the gods wanted him to be miserable, to suffer for eternity. But if in his task, a metaphor for all our lives, he can smile about it and keep going over and over, then he rebels and defies, is finding meaning where there is none. Because our human brains have to do that, and he is happy about it, not overcome with sorrows. He is the epitome. Is the epitome of the abstract. Is the epitome of the absurdist hero. By extension, so too are you, the epitome of the absurdist hero. That's a part of my question. Why is his task a metaphor for our lives? I can imagine this if our lives were all full of monotonous labor and wouldn't offer any personal benefits at the end. But they are not like that. And Camus surely knew the differences between a diverse life and a monotonous labor. Even if someone would force us into Sisyphus like a situation, there is a possibility for us to rebel physically and change the situation. Because even if you find interesting and varied things to do, ultimately your existence will never have a clear point, a reason, a purpose in a larger existential sense. No matter what you actually do, there is a futility in doing it, because one day it'll be over and you will have no clearer understanding of what matters than when you did. You might have told yourself there is a purpose, a reason, or some justification, and some end goals, but that's all subjective, and who knows if you are right. We all roll over boulders up the hills. Changing boulders doesn't change the cycle. Just wait, okay? What is a very large rock, okay? Boulder, detached, okay? And she says that somewhere this one, we all roll our boulders up the hill. Changing the boulder doesn't change the cycle. I'm late as hell, but this dialogue is beautiful, brother. Thanks for sharing, okay? So this is all the comment I'm reading Reddit, where people are having a discussions about the why, because in the last it is mentioned that Sisyphus happy, but why do we have to imagine Sisyphus happy? uh the essay is done, but at the end I think I got to know about the Sisyphus. I know before, but I got to know in depth because of the Dr. Anand Ranganathan, and he has written an article about it, giving a real life examples of it. So I'll try to read it. And the article name is, I think it was written in 2014, and the article name is "The Slum That Must Not Be Burned." The slum that must not burn. I repeat, the slum that must not burn. Are the lives and the homes of those who lives in slum not important? And he starts with a quote of Camus, Albert Camus in the myth of Sisyphus. There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is a suicide. I repeat, there is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is a suicide. And 2014, a slum settlement barely a kilometer from where I live got burned to the ground. It housed around 700 families, but no one is sure of the exact numbers. The inferno, which began early morning and lasted till little before noon, reduced everything to ashes and dust. But late afternoon, the scene was that of a battle after battle, with the smoke rising from the smoldering belonging that now belonged to no one. Fire tender had come and gone. Women stood next to streaming corrugated in tin sheets, guarding them for use later. The sheet had wrapped and gone horribly out of shape, but still qualified as a roof over one's heads. The stench of burnt tarpaulin and polythene bags were overpowering. We had no time to even take spare clothes. As I said, Rahman, my steel trunk is missing, said Arun. I can't locate my jugi because someone else says it was his jugi at the spot, said Asim. We are lucky to be alive, said Aslam. Where will I sleep? Asked a man, gazing wistfully at the scene before him. Under the hot sun, the color had bleached from the panorama. Squid does that. Unused land upon which the slum stood is one of the most expensive pieces of the real estate in India. Reports soon appeared that the arson could not be ruled out, that the notorious cop mafia nexus had something to do with it. Whoever the culprit, whatever the reason, the land now lies cleansed, ready for use, ready to start $1 million condominiums. It is no longer blighted by the less fortunate voters of the country. The destruction of homes, if Tarpelium Street tin box could be called that, failed to make the 6 p.m. national news that evening. It is somewhat, someone's prerogative to decide what is news and what isn't. Perhaps the dispossessed are someone's prerogative too. Perhaps not. 50 meters from where I live is another slum. It has no name. Slums usually don't. They are landmarks. एक झुकी आएगी उधर से लेफ्ट लेना फिर straight जाना. You will see a slum, take a left from there and then go straight. A slum is viewed as anyone, and a slum is viewed as an eyesore. Its image is to be vaccinated against, and the people who work as a construction site laborers, security guards, waiters, kirana store delivery boys, or domestic help, they arrive early morning for the work, and in the evening they vanish. They do not know where. The slum does not exist in the mind size. The slum is deceased. In the winters, when uneven footpath that runs along the length of the slum is bathed in warm sunlight, the slum dwellers can be seen populating it like we do in a train platform. The children play kancha, the men cards, the women knit or pick lice. When the winter ends, the slum dwellers inhabit the footpath opposite, like a forgotten heap of a construction sign that, with the passage of Indian Standard Time, relocates itself across the road, grain by grain, gust by gust. The slum dwellers shifts constantly, looking for an agreeable space. Meanwhile, city traffic slides past like an unannounced train, impatient cars, marauding, school buses, wayward, half scooters, half thela contraptions. They ignore the slums and its taming life. This is the land of the billion stories, and we are only interested in us. The slum is large. There's a picture. Okay, the slum is large. The lady tea vendor at its gates tells me it's housed around 500 families. That's a lot, man. 500 families. It's not talking about the 500 people. 500 families. Now just multiply on an average how many people. Especially in a poor family, they have a lot of people. On an average, if you say they have 5 people, 5 is 25, 2,500 people. Uncollected garbage lies strewn beside her shack, and it's being nibbled by and at by strays as she pours chai and she fishes out bread pakoras from a kadai. I think when I see the Instagrams and all, I actually kind of feel sad that was being born in a country like India. I'm not talking about all the people. I'm talking specifically about the poor people, and not just in India. Because I'm specifically right now talking about India, but not just in India, other kind of poor countries also. Is being born in this country, in this city, a crime, or or does that mean that we have done something evil in the past life, or considered to be unlucky person? Because the infrastructure is not there. You have to sleep in a garbage area if you're a poor, especially if you live in a slum area. But why? Why? If the same person, if he or she were born in some other developed countries, they have a good life, even if they don't own anything, if they don't have any of that thing. But why? Is it a crime to be born here? Is it I mean, I don't know, man. It's very difficult to comprehend this fact. Sometimes I do get very frustrated and angry at the politicians, not just current politicians, but of the late 1940, 50, 60, 70, 80, 2000s. I mean, what were they doing? Please answer. What were you guys doing? A crowd collects, people are eager to talk. The Sarkar has done nothing for us, says the lady. The slum is 20 years old, but we have no pipe water, no drainage. Electricity, I asked, the roofs, the tarpual, okay, I don't know what does that is, but yeah, it says that their tarpaulin way down by the brick and rusting cycle are teeming with the satellite dishes and jumbles of cables and transformer boxes. They gave us electricity only 3 years ago, and after they found out we were, tapping it illegally, they didn't know they didn't know you were tapping it illegally. Of course, they knew. Laughed this lady. Just that the police got greedy. They wanted more. Half the bribes we refused. I venture in. The slum is labyrinth of lanes that are so narrow at places only one man can pass through. In no time, I am lost. A bare-chested man emerged from his shack just at this instant. I smile and he smiles back. I came to Delhi in 1994. Says Nageshwar Das. I came to Delhi. Okay, from Darbhanga. All this. He sweeps his arm in diagonally. All he be made brick by brick. I've seen this slum come up from a new hertz to now this. Is this shack yours? Yes, says Das. I'm lucky. You know what the going rent is for the ones of these shacks. No, 2,500 rupees per month minimum, and now people have to pay for the electricity too. It's madness. I'm lucky. We are distracted by loud laughter and Tamil being spoken rapidly. Madrasis, says Das. This slum has people from all corners of India: Biharis, Madrasis, Rajasthani, Nepali, Bengalis, Bangladeshis. Even you want to meet the Madrasis? I nod and we talked about the Madrasis. Okay, so he's talking about Madrasis because Anand he is from Tamil, if I'm not wrong. You understand what they were saying? Nageshwari, I asked. Nageshwari looked at me with a poker face. Silvar Kumar, a young, smart, and mustache, hail from Tirukular, a town in Viluppuram district of Tamil Nadu, he adds. How often do you go back to Tilaguna? I asked him. Once a year. In the winter, I came to Delhi 15 years ago, boarded the train one day, and as simple as that awful fire the one day. It happens, it's normal, says Shivla. His friends conquer. When I came to Delhi, I was on my own. So I was not bothered by where I slept, where or what I ate. I just walked. I just wanted to work. Slum fires are very common. When I was young, I used to think, what will I lose if a fire engulfs my slum? What are my positions? Life was peaceful, but now I'm married, man with the children. I have to think of my school, hospital, of this and that. Fire bothers me now. He met his wife here in Delhi, says Silva's friend abruptly. The men laugh. The fire cannot be discussed anymore. Is she Tamilian? I ask Silva. Yes, he smiles. Folks back home are happy. I get the feeling the men wanted to get back to their card games. Thank you, Silva, I say and move on. I realize after a while that I'm wandering the lanes purposelessly. Open drains, corroded desert coolers, TV soaps blaring out emotional rants. A small girl blowing into a chulpa. The image and sounds registers and fade outs to make space for more of a dark interiors made visible because of a certain rot flirted the curtain of a busy people leading a normal life. Mohammed Isad greets me at the slum grocery stores, a cave-like shack with growing shelves stocked with the Parle G and wafer packets that appears swollen past 3 shelves by date. He too is one of the pioneers. I came from a district, Howrah, in 1994. That is in Kolkata. Says Isa. Why? For work. What else? There were hardly any jugis here, not more than a dozen. And now I look at this place. No one ever tried to evict people from here. They did many times, but we are in thousands now. We are strong. We made the slums. It's ours. We started to walk towards a small eatery where community, says Lisa. There is no differences between the slum and these colonies you see around. Just that this place is dirtier. Everyone here works, men, women, even children. Everybody is busy. If you have forgotten to ask the governments for things, we are self-sufficient. It's normal life with a TV, fridge, mobile, work, school. What is the problem? But everyone is used to it. Walking to the tanker every morning. I mean, the fire that burned down. Thank God no life was lost. The people will return. They will build their jugis in no time. It wasn't a pakka slum. Some tea. I declined the invitations and waved goodbye the last. I mean, just imagine, okay, I know for a fact I've seen a documentary in a YouTube and all that. The common people, I'm talking about the lower middle class people, they wait 3 4 hours early morning to get a water, and even in there you have a long queue. And then there's a lot of quarrel between them only, that I want first, I want then. But why do we have to wait 3 4 hours? That's the loss of our productive wages. And not just that, I mean, even in a traffic lights you waste a lot of time in a traffic. And not just that, even in a washroom, the toilet, you have to wake up very early. I mean, I've heard some people say that you have to wake up, if you don't want to stay in the long queue, then you have to, because it's a public toilet, and then you have to wake up at 4 in the morning just to go and do it fast. And so that you don't, because if you wake up at 6 7, then obviously it's going to be a very packed, because the people usually do there's things at that time, and then all the people come there. Just imagine about the fact of this. It's been more than how many, 70, now it's coming to 80, more than 80 years of independence, and still the people are living like this. What are the governments doing? That's the question. I mean, I'm not just giving, just I'm not just pointing the entire onus to the government also. I mean, they are to be, but what had happened in the last 80 years? I don't know. It's getting on. And as I look for my way out, thought bothers me. What am I doing here? Am I a foreign correspondent writing for a foreign newspaper, trying to sell to my foreign readers Islam? Or am I an Indian writer looking for untold grief as to inform my Indian readers of it? Why did I visit this slum? For what? For what purpose did I lose myself in its narrow lanes? Did I expect to find something new, something different, a way of life that I, an Indian, didn't know of earlier? But how is that even possible? We Indians know of every misery there is. I think it just happened. I just decided to visit the slum without knowing why. This journey was without its aim, without its reward. Must everything belong to a reason, or to be accountable, or to judgment? There's nothing unusual about a slum or about the people who live in it. A billion lives are being led, and no two ways of leading it are the same. The slum is a microcosm of what we are. The nation might have failed us, but we aren't failures. The slum, with its inhabitants drawn from all corners of India, speaking a dozen languages, wearing different attires, employed in different jobs, the slum is in fact that intangible, superfluous, ephemeral idea of India, built by the Mormons, brick by brick, lane by lane, without any outside support. And when it is brought down by arson or bulldozer, the Mormon builds it again. A slum evolves like an animal does. So its people live on a hope for a better future. They laugh and they cry and they breathe in the misery, but don't begrudge it. But most of all, they wait for their country to give them that one chance, for they are tired of living out the absurdist philosophy most have only written about. That's the struggle that alone is okay. That the struggle alone is enough to fill a man's heart, and one must imagine Sisyphus to be happy. Camus in the myth of Sisyphus. So this is an article by Anand Ranganathan. And okay, are there any more articles? There is but truth. Okay. On why it's only fair that we wait for the trough of the BJP wave and the media refusal to let election rifles. Okay, so let's see if there's anything. Okay, so it's not there. So yeah, that is it. And thank you everyone for listening. I don't know who all are listening, but this is a very short essay on the topic of the myths, of the Sisyphus, and Tenzin is signing off.